There's a part of you that you've never truly met. It dreams, it fears, it acts, and it makes decisions for you. Carl Jung dedicated his life to exploring this hidden side of the mind, the unconscious. And what he uncovered goes far beyond psychology. It's a living philosophy, a symbolic map of the human soul. In this video, you'll step into the world of the shadow, the self, archetypes, and the forces that shape your mind, even when you think you're the one in control. These 30 ideas reveal the deepest mysteries of the psyche, and after Jung, what you call you will no longer feel like a certainty, and the world itself may begin to look like a reflection of your own unconscious. The collective unconscious is perhaps one of Carl Gustav Jung's boldest and most profound ideas. It's not just about the individual mind, with its memories, traumas, and desires, but something much bigger, ancestral, and in a way, sacred. A shared psychic structure that holds the essential blueprint of the human soul. To truly understand this deep dimension of the psyche, we have to let go of the modern idea that we're just isolated individuals, shaped only by logic and daily experiences. Jung invites us into a kind of spiritual metaphysics, where the soul doesn't just belong to you, it's collective, beyond the individual. As Plato once said, to know yourself is to know the universe and the gods. Jung believed that saying holds more truth than we realize. The collective unconscious isn't something we acquire. It's not shaped by culture or personal experience. It's inherited, like instincts. We're born with it. It's the rich soil where archetypes grow. Those universal patterns of feeling, seeing, and behaving. These patterns have always been with us, in ancient myths, religions, fairy tales, dreams, and even in art. As Jung put it, the collective unconscious holds the wisdom of humanity through the ages. Think about this. Your fear of the dark may carry the weight of thousands of years of ancestral fear. And when you dream of a serpent, you're tapping into a symbol that's shown up in Egyptian temples, indigenous rituals, biblical stories, and the visions of artists. Jung called this symbolic potential. Images that don't live in memory, but in the deep structure of the psyche. In other words, it's not just you dreaming of the hero, the mother, the wise old man, or the monster. We all dream of them, across cultures, across time. That reveals something powerful. Beneath our surface-level differences, we all share a symbolic language, a shared spiritual foundation. And why does this matter? Because we live in a fragmented age. Modern people, trapped in the ego, believe they're separate, self-sufficient, disconnected from history and humanity. But that illusion comes at a cost: loneliness, emptiness, confusion. When we deny the collective unconscious, we deny our spiritual inheritance. We become soul orphans. Jungian psychology offers a path back, not to the literal past, but to the symbolic memory of humanity. Jung invites us to listen to our dreams, reflect on myths, and respect rituals. He reminds us that even in a world ruled by logic and technology, we are still the children of Dionysus, Osiris, Christ. Archetypal images that speak not to the mind, but to the soul. And this isn't about religion. It's about recognizing that inside you, and all of us, there's a symbolic intelligence trying to speak. And it speaks through images, feelings, and spontaneous movements of the unconscious. Like a river beneath the surface, it flows whether or not we're listening. Nietzsche, who influenced Jung indirectly, once said, "He who fights with monsters should be careful not to become one. And if you gaze long into the abyss also gazes into you." The collective unconscious is that symbolic abyss. It's not evil, it's mystery. It's the soul of the world reflected within you. Jungian psychology calls for a new kind of ethics, a deep listening, not just to others, but to what moves inside all of us. When you feel a powerful emotion you don't understand, or when an image keeps appearing for no clear reason, maybe the collective unconscious is speaking, and when you honor that, by meditating, writing, making art, or simply dreaming with honesty, you're not just healing yourself, you're healing something in the human soul. As Jung said, what we do not face in ourselves, we will meet as fate. That's the beauty of the collective unconscious. It connects us. It breaks the illusion of separation. It reminds us that our pain isn't just ours, and neither is our light. We are all threads in the same symbolic tapestry. That's why diving into deep psychology isn't just therapy, it's a spiritual path. A journey back to what modern life has forgotten, the soul. And the soul, as Jung insisted, doesn't belong to science or organized religion. The soul is living symbol, and to live symbolically is to live with depth. So next time you have a strange dream, an unexpected intuition, or feel moved by a work of art, pause. Listen. Maybe the collective unconscious is whispering, and that whisper might be exactly what you need to remember that you are not alone. You are part of something greater, something ancient, something eternal, and this is just the beginning. If the collective unconscious is the invisible stage of the human psyche, then archetypes are its eternal characters. Carl Gustav Jung defined archetypes as universal patterns of human experience, built-in frameworks that shape not just what we feel, but how we feel, not just what we see, but how we perceive. They are, in essence, invisible molds that organize our emotions, behaviors, and symbols before we even have the words to describe them. Archetypes don't come from experience. They're what make experience possible in the first place. Think about a newborn baby. They've never seen their mother's face, but instinctively they reach for the breast, feel safe in her warmth. That readiness of the psyche is archetypal, an emotional and symbolic instinct that comes before logic, acting without being taught. Like Plato's forms, archetypes are pure structures. But unlike Plato's metaphysical ideas, Jung's archetypes live inside the human soul. They are living images, and that's what makes them so beautiful. Archetypes aren't content, they're forms. An archetype isn't a mother, but the eternal image of motherhood, which can show up as the biological mother, Mother Nature, the goddess, the witch, the nurturer, or even the destroyer, endless masks of the same symbolic face. This ability to shift forms is what makes them so powerful. Archetypes adapt to cultures, eras, and contexts, but their essence remains unchanged. They pulse through ancient Greek myths, biblical stories, soap operas, Hollywood blockbusters, and even your dreams. When you dream of a hero, you're not just reliving a personal fantasy, you're tapping into a timeless pattern that has inspired people for generations to face chaos with courage. Jung identified several fundamental archetypes: the hero, the wise old man, the mother, the child, the shadow, the crone, the trickster, the anima and animus, all symbolic portraits of the inner human journey. But the most important of them all, the central archetype, is the self, the totality that integrates all the others. Archetypes are like magnets. They pull experience toward themselves. When someone or something resonates with an archetype within you, a force is triggered. You don't just fall in love with the person in front of you. You fall for the archetype they represent. The muse, the warrior, the healer. That's what makes archetypes so powerful, and also so dangerous. They hypnotize, stir up deep emotion, and often act on us without us realizing. That's why Jung said, the archetype itself is empty and unconscious, only a starting point for experience. You fill it in with your life, but the shape was already there. Advertisers know this. So do charismatic leaders. Powerful brands, religions, and ideologies are built around archetypes, not because someone made them up, but because they already live inside the human psyche. A car brand might symbolize strength, the modern-day warrior. A politician might present themselves as the protective father or the Messiah. These images work because they speak not just to our reason, but to our soul. But archetypes can also trap us. When someone blindly identifies with an archetype, like the hero, they can become fanatical, messianic, blind to limits. That's the danger of archetypal inflation. When a person believes they are more than they are, possessed by an image bigger than themselves. For Jung, the key is symbolic awareness, learning to dialogue with the archetypes without being consumed by them. That happens through art, dreams, reflection, and active imagination. It's the middle path between being controlled and being in control. It's like dancing with ancestral fire, with reverence, but with awareness. So understanding. Archetypes isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's a path of self-discovery. It's asking, which archetypes are active in my life right now? Which one am I identifying with? Which one am I running from? What myth am I unconsciously living out? When you start becoming aware of this, something shifts. Life gains depth. Your choices feel more meaningful. Your encounters stop feeling like random events. You begin to live with intention because you're touching the symbolic fabric of reality. As Joseph Campbell, who was deeply influenced by Jung, once said, "Myths are public dreams and dreams are private myths." Archetypes are the bridge between the two. They show us that even in our most personal moments, we're part of something universal. So the journey of consciousness is also an aesthetic and ethical one. To live symbolically is to honor archetypes without becoming enslaved to them. To let them inspire, but not consume you. You are not just you. You're also the hero, the sage, the lover, the martyr. And at the same time, you are none of them. Because the archetype isn't your destiny, it's an invitation. The only question that remains is, which image is guiding your life right now? And are you aware of it? At the heart of Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology lies a concept that shines like a guiding star on the soul's inner journey: the self. This isn't about our ordinary identity or a surface-level idea of the self. In Jung's vision, the self is both the regulating center of the psyche and its ultimate wholeness. It represents who we truly are and who we are meant to become. Unlike the ego, our conscious identity, tied to daily life, the self is much larger than consciousness. It includes both what we know and what we don't know about ourselves. It is the whole, not just a part. The ego lives in time, seeks safety, and tries to stay in control. The self lives in mystery, transformation, and unity. Imagine the psyche as a circle. The ego is a point inside it, necessary but limited. The self, on the other hand, is the entire circle. It contains the conscious and the unconscious, the known and the unknown, the light and the shadow, and its role is to guide the psyche toward integration. This integration isn't just a psychological idea, it's what Jung called the teleological principle of life. Teleological means it points toward an inner purpose, a meaningful end. The self is like a quiet inner compass that leads us forward. It drives us, even in our darkest moments, to seek wholeness, not perfection, but completeness. The self shows up in symbolic forms, as a circle, a mandala, a divine figure, an old sage, a golden child, or even paradoxical images like the union of masculine and feminine, destruction and creation. Jung noticed that in dreams, the self often appears as a figure that leaves a powerful impression, inspiring awe, fear, or deep reverence. These images aren't random. They point to something beyond the personal, something larger than us, and yet something we are called to become. The self, by nature, transcends logical opposites. It brings opposites together. It doesn't erase pain. It integrates it. It doesn't deny the shadow. It sheds light on it. The self doesn't force, it calls, and that call often arrives in the form of a crisis. Yes. The breakdown of the ego can be the awakening of the self. When our social roles fall apart, when our goals lose meaning, when existential pain becomes too loud to ignore, it's often the self beginning to rise from deep within. It pulls us inward, forces us to stop running, and teaches us, not with theories, but through symbolic and transformational experiences. It's no surprise Jung associated the self with the divine, not in a dogmatic way, but an archetypal one. The self is the inner God image, the psychological absolute. As Jung put it, the self is the image of God within us, not a God outside, institutionalized, but a living, numinous presence at the heart of the soul. The self is the inner temple each of us must visit and honor. The process of individuation, which Jung described as the path of becoming who you are, is centered on the self. To individuate is to build a relationship between the ego and the self. It means realizing the ego isn't in charge of everything. It means opening space for the self to lead. That relationship isn't easy. The ego is naturally resistant, defensive, controlling. It fears losing its power, but the self doesn't want to destroy the ego. It wants to educate it, expand it, purify it. Like a silent spiritual teacher, the self guides, but waits for the student to be ready. And that's where many people get stuck, because the self's call requires sacrifice. The sacrifice of control, the sacrifice of the false self, the sacrifice of masks. As the old alchemists, so admired by Jung, used to say, nothing transforms without fire. The self is that symbolic fire. It burns to transmute, but the reward is priceless. Connecting with the self brings meaning, not in the shallow sense of a career goal or external success, but a deep existential meaning rooted in inner truth. Living from the self means living in deep alignment, acting from your center, knowing that even in chaos there is an invisible order guiding your path. You don't achieve the self all at once. Jung called it an asymptotic ideal, something we always approach but never fully reach. But it's the journey toward it that changes us. It humanizes us. It makes us more compassionate, humble, whole. The self isn't a trophy. It's a presence, and maybe the greatest modern tragedy is forgetting that presence. We live saturated with ego, comparison, judgment, anxiety. But inside each of us is a spark that doesn't get sick, that doesn't get corrupted, that patiently waits. The self is that spark. And reconnecting with it is reconnecting with what's most sacred in us. The journey is long, but necessary. And it starts with a simple question. Am I living from my ego or listening to the call of myself? If this message resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. This space is a symbolic temple for those who want to understand themselves with honesty and depth. Your journey deserves to be witnessed with awareness. Out of all of Jung's concepts, perhaps none is as deeply existential as individuation. More than a theory, it's an inner calling, an ethical and spiritual process that goes beyond self-knowledge. It's the journey of becoming who you truly are. A radical path toward authenticity. Jung saw individuation as the real purpose of human life, not as a fixed destination, but as a symbolic journey where a person moves away from superficial identities and starts to follow a deeper, inner principle, the wholeness of the soul. So it's more than self-awareness, it's inner fulfillment. At this point, Jungian psychology deeply echoes ancient Greek philosophy. The Greeks called it arete, moral excellence, the full realization of one's true nature. For Socrates, this excellence wasn't about outward performance, but the result of a life examined and guided by the daimon, the inner voice that leads a person down their true path. Jung revived this ideal. The Socratic daimon becomes, in analytical psychology, the living image of the self, the archetypal guide of individuation. But what does it mean in practice to individuate? It means to stop living based on how others see you. It means no longer shaping yourself to meet social, moral, or family expectations. It's a process of breaking away, but also of discovery. It's leaving behind what's false, not out of rebellion, but out of loyalty to the soul. Jung once said, "What you deny in yourself in the name of adaptation will one day return as suffering." To individuate is to accept the risk of being different. It's to face the conflict between what your ego wants and what your soul demands, and that hurts. It hurts because in order to become whole, you have to confront the shadow. You have to let go of the persona, the mask you wear to be accepted. Sometimes you have to say no, even when everyone else is saying yes. But that pain is fertile. It's the pain of inner birth. As Nietzsche, another thinker who deeply influenced Jung, said, "You must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star." Individuation is that symbolic birth, not of a new self, but of the real self. And there's no preset path. Each individuation journey is singular, unique, and unrepeatable, because the self, the inner center that guides this journey, speaks to each person in their own symbolic language, sometimes through dreams, other times through intuition, illness, rupture, or synchronicity. The outer world seems to rearrange itself when the call of the self grows stronger. Still, the process isn't solitary. It requires deep listening. It requires silence. It requires the courage to face what's been buried for years: trauma, fear, desire, wounds. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." In other words, to individuate is also to descend into the depths. But there's light in that descent, because the more a person integrates what they've rejected, the closer they get to wholeness. And that's where the ethics of individuation live. To become who you truly are, with honesty, is an act of responsibility toward the world. Someone who becomes whole no longer needs to control others, manipulate, compete, or lie, because they're no longer searching outside for something that can only be found within. Individuation is, therefore, an ethical and spiritual process. Ethical because it demands conscious choices rooted in values that come from the soul, not from social norms. Spiritual because it touches something beyond logic. Symbols, archetypes, images that connect us to the mystery of life. In that sense, individuation also has a collective value, because a person who becomes whole contributes to the healing of society. As Jung said, the world doesn't need more successful people, it needs more whole people. The shadow each of us refuses to face gets projected into politics, religion, and culture. Collective chaos is born from the avoidance of individual growth. Existential philosophy saw this too. Kierkegaard spoke of the despair of not being oneself. Heidegger described the inauthentic man as one who lives absorbed by the expectations of the anonymous they. Individuation is resistance to this massification. It's saying, "I am," and standing by it, even when it hurts. But let's be clear, individuation isn't selfishness. The journey isn't narcissistic. On the contrary, it's only possible when the ego is willing to serve something greater. A true individual doesn't close themselves off. They open up, not to lose themselves in others, but to relate with honesty. Because only someone who has found themselves can truly find someone else. To individuate is, at its core, to answer the call of the soul, to listen to the inner daemon, even if the world laughs, criticizes, or turns away. It's to turn life into a unique work of art. It's, as Heraclitus said, to become who you are. And that takes time, patience, and humility. This isn't a path for everyone, but it's the only one that leads to inner freedom. There's a hidden part in each of us, denied, uncomfortable, and yet essential. Jung called this part the shadow. And understanding the shadow isn't just a psychological exercise, it's a moral act of courage, because it means looking at what you'd rather never see. The shadow is everything you reject in yourself, everything you've suppressed in order to be accepted, loved, or seen as good. It's made up of the parts of your personality that were pushed out of your awareness. Aggressive impulses, envy, fear, greed, pride, arrogance, and even sexual desire. But it also includes forgotten talents, repressed strengths, and abandoned virtues. The shadow isn't just bad, it's what was rejected. Here's a key point. The shadow isn't born from evil, it's born from exclusion. It forms when we try too hard to be only good, when we seek approval at the cost of truth, when we build an identity around what's socially acceptable. Jung warned, the person who doesn't face their shadow ends up controlled by it, and calls it fate. But the shadow doesn't go away just because we ignore it. In fact, it grows stronger. One of its most dangerous ways of showing up is through projection. Instead of recognizing our own anger, fear, or pride, we see it in others. The other becomes the villain, the enemy, the one to blame. This is how prejudice, social conflict, and fanaticism are born. When a person projects their shadow, they lose sight of personal responsibility. They accuse others without realizing they're accusing themselves. It's the old story of seeing the speck in someone else's eye while ignoring the log in your own. Jung believed this was one of the greatest sources of human destruction. But there's a better path, a harder one, but a more honest one: self-confrontation. Facing the shadow is an ethical choice. It means choosing the mirror over the spotlight. It means asking, what am I avoiding in myself? Not to feel guilt, but to take responsibility. The shadow doesn't need to be eliminated. It needs to be acknowledged and integrated, and that changes everything. Because when you integrate your shadow, you become whole. You stop wasting energy keeping up appearances. You stop projecting your pain onto others. You gain depth, presence, and authenticity. It's like your soul stops screaming and starts whispering, because finally, it's been heard. This process takes humility. It takes silence. It takes the willingness to see yourself stripped of ego. Many people avoid this path because it wounds their pride, but that's exactly why it's freeing. Jung said that encountering the shadow is the first step toward transformation. Without it, any spirituality is shallow, any ethics are weak, and any love is conditional. And the shadow doesn't show up just anywhere. It appears during tension, in uncontrollable impulses, in patterns that keep repeating, in disturbing dreams. Sometimes it even hides behind justice, righteous anger, or courage. But behind those masks, there's often resentment, fear, or a need for control. So to truly live ethically, you have to face the shadow. Ethics here isn't about following outside rules. It's about facing yourself. It's owning the contradictions within you. As Jung put it, evil isn't something we fight outside of ourselves, but something we recognize within. This view goes beyond shallow morality. While conventional morality divides people into good or bad, right or wrong, shadow work understands that darkness isn't out there. It's part of being human. And that doesn't condemn us. It makes us more human. The shadow is the guardian of what's real. It keeps us from creating idealized versions of ourselves. That's why the greatest spiritual teachers, the true wise ones, always went through the dark night of the soul. Christ in the desert, Buddha facing Mara, Moses in exile. There is no lasting light without first knowing darkness. In the end, integrating the shadow is about making peace with the full experience of being alive. It means understanding that human beings are made of opposites. And maturity isn't about denying one side. It's about learning how to hold the paradox. That's what separates the naive from the wise. The naive seeks purity. The mature seek truth. The naive projects. The mature integrates. The naive wants to eliminate the shadow. The mature wants to listen to it. And surprisingly, the shadow is also a source of power. Wherever we've buried our fear, we've also buried our strength. Many talents are buried under shame. Many virtues are locked away by fear of failure. When we face the shadow, we don't just release the dark, we recover the light. The shadow isn't your enemy, it's an invitation to honesty, to humility, to depth. And the real question is, are you ready to look at yourself without the mask? We live surrounded by faces. Faces that greet, that work, that socialize. But not all of them are real. Carl Jung called this face we build for the world the persona, a social mask, necessary for living in society, but one that can easily become a trap. The word persona comes from Latin and originally referred to the masks worn by actors in Roman theatre. It was the face shown to the audience, not the actor's true self. In analytical psychology, this metaphor is taken seriously. The persona is the social role we play. The good son, the competent professional, the loyal friend, the model citizen. These are the masks we often wear just to get by. And the persona does have a valid function. It helps us navigate society. Without it, we'd be completely exposed, unfiltered, vulnerable to the world's demands. Jung acknowledged the necessity of the persona. It shapes our public identity, protects our inner world, and allows us to interact with others. But the danger lies in mistaking the mask for the face, in believing we are what we appear to be. This is where the existential tension between authenticity and adaptation begins. On one side, the need to belong. On the other, the need to be true to ourselves. The more we identify with the persona, the further we drift from who we really are. That's the risk of self-alienation. And here's the tricky part. This alienation often goes unnoticed because the persona is praised, validated, and rewarded. It brings status, applause, and success. But all of that can become a golden cage, an identity tailor-made to please others while quietly suffocating the soul. Jung warned that when the persona becomes too rigid, a person ends up living a life that isn't theirs, just a constant performance, empty of meaning. Eventually, a crisis becomes inevitable because the soul, sooner or later, demands authenticity. And that demand shows up as anxiety, dissatisfaction, and existential emptiness. The person starts to wonder, why am I doing what I do? Who am I living for? Who am I when no one's watching? These are questions the persona can't answer because it doesn't know who you are. It only knows how to be accepted. There's a price for authenticity, and often a much higher price for avoiding it. The longer we stay attached to the mask, the harder it becomes to take it off because it fuses with the ego. We start believing we are what we portray, and any attempt to change feels like betrayal, madness, or danger. Jungian psychology offers a more balanced path. Don't destroy the persona, but don't surrender to it either. Learn to consciously separate it from the self. Know that the persona is a role, not your essence. A costume, not your skin. And that takes deep self-knowledge. In dreams, the persona often shows up as clothing, a facade, or an artificial face. Sometimes it falls off. Other times it suffocates. These are symbolic images of the tension between the true self and the social self. When the unconscious starts presenting these images, it means something inside you is ready to change. This process can be painful because it often means dismantling a carefully constructed image built over years. It means admitting you're not as perfect, strong, or certain as you seem, but it also means discovering that you're more alive, more complex, and more real than you ever dared to show. And that discovery is freeing, because it not only liberates you from others' expectations, it frees you from your own internal self-censorship. It allows you to live with more lightness, more coherence, more courage. It allows you to say no without guilt, to choose paths that may not please everyone, but are true to your soul. Existential philosophy recognizes this dilemma. Sartre spoke of bad faith, the self-deception of becoming a character in your own role. Kierkegaard warned against aesthetic, or life, living only to please while avoiding truth. The persona is the stage for that illusion, a theatre where the actor forgets their acting. But this doesn't mean you should abandon your social roles. It means living them with awareness. Being a teacher, a doctor, a mother, a friend. These are all parts of who you are, not the whole. True freedom begins when you can wear the mask, without becoming it. Jung said that real transformation begins when a person realizes the persona doesn't reflect the fullness of their soul, when they dare to take it off, not in public, but within. When they choose truth, even when the world prefers appearances. And the most beautiful part, letting go of a rigid persona doesn't make you lose connection with others. It makes your relationships more real. Because when you stop performing, you start truly connecting. Listening becomes deeper. Eye contact becomes more honest. Presence becomes more alive. The persona is a tool, not your destiny. It can serve life, but it shouldn't rule it. And it fulfills its role only when it leaves space for the authentic self to emerge. So the question is, how much is the mask you wear still serving you? And how much is it hiding what's most true in you? Inside every human being, no matter their biological sex or gender identity, there are two complementary and archetypal forces, the anima and the animus. These Jungian concepts represent, respectively, the feminine aspect in a man's psyche and the masculine aspect in a woman's psyche. They're not about social roles or typical personality traits, but about deep structures that live in the unconscious. Jung saw anima and animus as expressions of the symbolic androgynous self, the archetypal union of opposites, the yin and yang of the soul. They're not people or ideas, but inner forces that, when integrated, lead to deep personal transformation. Their purpose isn't to reinforce gender stereotypes, but to show that wholeness requires us to embrace the opposite within. The anima, present in a man's psyche, is the archetypal image of the feminine. It's not about real women, but a symbolic representation of sensitivity, intuition, inner life, and creative energy. When a man denies or represses his anima, he often becomes emotionally rigid, overly controlling, or coldly rational. He loses his ability to feel, to listen, and to connect with life's mystery. But when the anima is integrated, it becomes a bridge to the unconscious, a source of imagination, empathy, and emotional depth. A man who connects with his anima doesn't become feminine in a superficial sense. He becomes whole. He gains access to an inner source that helps him love, create, listen, and transform. The animus, on the other hand, operates in a woman's psyche as the image of the masculine. It represents inner strength, structured thought, and the power to take a stand in the world. A woman disconnected from her animus might struggle with passivity, emotional dependence, or a lack of direction. But when the animus is recognized and developed, it gives her clarity, assertiveness, and purpose. This process, however, is rarely smooth. Jung observed that both the anima and the animus have shadow sides. When left unintegrated, they can become disruptive, even destructive, forces in the psyche. The negative anima can show up as emotional manipulation, fantasy, or moodiness. The negative animus may appear as rigid thinking, coldness, or harsh criticism. Often, people project their unintegrated anima or animus onto others. A man might project his anima onto an idealized woman, expecting her to embody everything he's rejected in himself. A woman might project her animus onto authority figures, hoping they'll save her or bring her security. These projections can lead to relationships built on unrealistic expectations, dependence, and frustration. But the pain of these projections carries an opportunity. Because the true purpose of anima and animus is to act as psychopomps, soul guides. When acknowledged, they help the ego connect with the self. The anima guides the man into the deeper waters of the soul. The animus helps the woman ground and express her inner truth in the outer world. When these inner forces are integrated, something powerful happens, a reconciliation of opposites within. It's not about becoming half masculine, half feminine, but reaching a mature inner balance where these energies are in dialogue, not conflict. The soul becomes more stable, more creative, more free. This integration is a key part of the individuation process. It takes symbolic work, introspection, dream exploration, creative expression, and honest reflection on relationships. It's not self-help. It's psychic alchemy, a transformation of inner forces into something more whole. In alchemical tradition, which Jung studied deeply, the androgynous figure often appears at the end of the great work, a symbol where masculine and feminine are united, not by erasing their differences, but by transcending the split. That's the deep truth Anima and Animus carry. We are dual by nature, but our essence points toward unity. Culturally, we still live in a world that reinforces the split between these inner polarities. Toxic masculinity represses the anima. Stereotyped femininity distorts the animus. The result is silent suffering, a symbolic imbalance that creates confusion in feelings, roles, and relationships. Healing begins with reclaiming these inner figures. Men who connect with their anima become more sensitive, compassionate, and in tune with their inner world. Women who integrate their animus become more empowered, clear, and spiritually grounded. Nothing is lost. Everything is strengthened. Jung said, "A man becomes whole when he embraces his inner feminine. A woman becomes whole when she embraces her inner masculine." It's an ongoing task, one that pulls us out of autopilot and into a deeper relationship with ourselves. And ultimately, this integration shows up in our relationships. Less projection, more maturity, more authenticity. Relationships between whole people, not between halves looking to be completed. Because once we make peace within, we stop expecting others to give us what only the soul can offer. So the question is, do you recognize the voice of your inner opposite? Or are you still projecting what needs to be welcomed within? We're all complex beings, but not chaotic ones. Carl Gustav Jung believed that behind the vast diversity of human personalities, there's an inner pattern, a kind of psychic logic that shapes how we perceive and respond to the world. He called this framework psychological types, a model of personality that goes beyond surface-level labels to offer a deep philosophical map of the mind. Jung developed the idea of psychological types to help explain why people think and feel so differently, even in the same situation. While some respond to a crisis with logic and practicality, others dive into emotions or follow their intuition. These differences aren't just about behavior, they reflect dominant inner functions that shape how we experience life. Jung identified 4 main functions of consciousness: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Each one represents a unique way of interpreting reality and processing experience. None is better or worse. They're just different pathways through which we navigate life. Thinking is focused on logic, analysis, and mental clarity. People with a dominant thinking function value structure, coherence, and objectivity. They're skilled at organizing information, making decisions based on facts, and seeing the world as a system to understand. But they might sometimes overlook emotional nuance or human complexity. Feeling, in Jung's framework, isn't just about emotion. It's a function that judges based on personal values, relationships, and empathy. People led by feeling make decisions with a strong sense of what's right or wrong, for themselves and others. They seek harmony and connection, but they may struggle when emotions clash or when moral dilemmas feel overwhelming. Sensation is all about the concrete, the real, the here and now. It grounds us in the physical world, what we can see, touch, and experience directly. Sensation types are practical, detail-oriented, and rooted in reality. But they may find it hard to engage with abstract ideas or symbolic meaning. Intuition, by contrast, picks up on the invisible, what's emerging, possible, or symbolic. Intuitive types sense patterns before they're obvious, trust gut feelings, and imagine futures that haven't arrived yet. They're imaginative, creative, often visionary, but they can lose touch with the present, miss important details, or float too far into ideas. These four functions operate in every person, but one is usually dominant. The others play supportive, tertiary, or even unconscious roles. Personal growth involves first recognizing your dominant function, then gradually integrating the others into your awareness. Jung also described two basic orientations of psychic energy: introversion and extroversion. Extroverts are energized by the external world, by activity, interaction, recognition. Introverts draw energy from within, from reflection, solitude, and inner depth. Again, one isn't better than the other. They're just different ways of engaging with life. Combining these functions and orientations creates 8 psychological types, like introverted thinking, extroverted sensation, introverted intuition, and so on. Each type has its own strengths, blind spots, and unique way of making sense of the world. More than a personality test or identity label, Jung's typology is a tool for self-awareness. It helps us understand how we operate, why we react the way we do, and what parts of ourselves we've neglected. It's a conscious roadmap toward inner balance and toward deeper understanding of others. Like much of Jung's work, this idea also carries ethical and philosophical weight. He didn't want us to cling rigidly to a type. He wanted us to use the insight to live more authentically and relate to others with more empathy. Because once we understand that others think and feel differently, and that's okay, real dialogue becomes possible. Ancient philosophy said the same. Heraclitus spoke of the logos, a unity of opposites. Plato taught that self-knowledge was the path to wisdom. Jung builds on that legacy and invites us to start the same way. Know your type, and then walk the path of integrating the rest. Because living one-sidedly, clinging to a single function or perspective, is living only half a life. Humans are plural, layered, full of contradictions, and maturity lies in learning to balance those parts. The thinker learns to feel, the sensor learns to imagine, the intuitive learns to stay grounded, the feeler learns to think with clarity. In this sense, psychological types aren't just a theory of personality, they're a philosophy of consciousness, a way of seeing the human being as a field of possibilities where inner balance is found through the honest integration of opposites. So, have you ever wondered which function drives you most? And maybe more importantly, which one have you been avoiding? What might that be costing you? Every step towards self-awareness is sacred. If this video felt like one of those steps, subscribe to the channel and keep walking this journey with us. The soul blossoms in good company. How many times has something coincidental happened so precisely, so meaningfully, that it felt impossible to chalk it up to pure chance? You think of someone, and they call you minutes later. A random word overheard on the street speaks directly to a personal dilemma you're facing. A book falls off a shelf, and the page it lands on has a sentence that feels written just for you. These things aren't rare, but they're rarely taken seriously. Carl Gustav Jung did take them seriously. He gave this phenomenon a name: synchronicity. The simultaneous occurrence of two events connected not by cause, but by meaning. In other words, these are meaningful coincidences that have no logical explanation, yet feel profoundly significant. Synchronicity breaks with the mechanical logic of linear cause and effect, and invites us to consider that reality is also symbolic. Jung developed this idea over many years and found support in conversations with physicists like Wolfgang Pauli, one of the pioneers of quantum mechanics. Together, they intuited that there's an order in the universe that is neither purely material nor purely mental, but something deeper that unifies mind and matter in a shared field of meaning. This idea challenges the dominant rationalist worldview in the West since the 17th century, the one that says everything must have a measurable cause, that randomness is just statistical noise, and that the world runs like a machine. Jung saw something different, a logic not of causality, but of meaning. For him, there are events we don't explain. We understand them because they speak directly to the soul. Synchronicity, then, asks for a shift in perception. It's not the world that changes, it's the way we look at it. The synchronous universe is one where symbols are alive, where events communicate, encounters teach, and coincidences reveal. It's a world where the unconscious shows up in outer reality, and outer reality responds to inner shifts. These moments often happen during life transitions or emotional intensity. Deep dreams, loss, crisis, meditation. In those liminal states, the veil between consciousness and the unconscious gets thin, and synchronicities show up like messages. It's as if the universe whispers, "I hear you." Jung noticed one key trait of synchronicity. It's deeply personal. What seems meaningless to one person can be life-changing to another. The meaning isn't in the event itself, it's in the connection between the event and the person experiencing it. Synchronicity is ultimately a phenomenon of consciousness. But let's be clear, this isn't about superstition or wishful thinking. Jung was careful to separate synchronicity from fantasy. For him, it was a real event in time, with a symbolic link to the inner world. It's not about wanting something and expecting the universe to deliver like a genie. It's about being so attuned to the unconscious that symbols naturally emerge in the outside world with the weight of revelation. This idea aligns with ancient spiritual traditions. In Stoic philosophy, for example, logos represents a meaningful, rational order in the cosmos. In Taoism, the Tao flows through everything, connecting seemingly unrelated events. Synchronicity carries the spirit of these traditions, a symbolic worldview that recognizes hidden intelligence within life itself. Jung went as far as to say that the self, the deepest part of the psyche, is the true author of synchronicity. In other words, the totality of who you are orchestrates external events to mirror internal states. Life stops being a random string of events and becomes a symbolic text, one that can be read, decoded, and understood as a call to wake up. This shift has powerful consequences. First, it teaches us to pay attention, to live more consciously, to stop ignoring the signs. Second, it brings back the sense of mystery, something essential to the soul. In a world overwhelmed by data, analysis, and prediction, synchronicity reminds us that some truths can't be controlled, only felt. And maybe most importantly, synchronicity invites us to trust that there is an order, even in the chaos, that we're not alone in an indifferent universe, but part of a web of connections, symbols, and messages. To live with this awareness is to live poetically. It's to understand that life speaks to us, but we may be listening with the wrong language. Synchronicity can't be predicted or forced, but it can be recognized, and when it is, it stirs something deep inside, a feeling of awe, calm, and wonder. A quiet message that says, you're on the right path. As Jung once wrote, what we call coincidence is the way God chooses to remain anonymous. And maybe that's the heart of synchronicity, an invisible presence that can be felt, an order not imposed but revealed, a quiet clue left in the world by a soul that longs to remember itself. At some point in life, we all experience reactions that seem exaggerated, out of proportion, or even hard to explain. A harmless comment cuts deep. A simple critique sparks sudden anger. A memory from years ago still paralyzes us. Behind these reactions, more often than not, lies something Carl Gustav Jung called a complex. Complexes are like emotional clusters within the psyche. Jung defined them as bundles of feelings, thoughts, and memories tied to a specific emotional theme that organize themselves unconsciously. Even though they live beneath the surface, they have enormous influence over our conscious behavior. When activated, they take over, like little selves inside us. Take someone with a rejection complex, for example. Anytime they feel criticized or left out, their reaction becomes intense, not because the situation truly justifies so much pain, but because it awakens an old emotional chain, a wound, a pattern, a voice whispering, "You're not loved." A complex works like a filter. It distorts how we see reality. What someone says gets interpreted not by what was meant, but by what was felt, often decades ago. And you can't just turn off that filter with logic, because complexes aren't conscious, even though their effects are felt deeply. Jung noticed that the psyche isn't one unified structure. It's made up of multiple centers of energy, and complexes are like satellites orbiting the ego. Sometimes they get so close that they hijack consciousness. We act, speak, and feel as if we're someone else, and in a way we are. We've been overtaken by something unconscious. That's why Jung said, "We don't have complexes. Complexes have us." That flips the perspective and shows just how autonomous these inner forces can be. They don't ask for permission. Triggered by a word, a gesture, a smell, or a memory, they flood the mind with disproportionate force. But it's important to clarify, complexes aren't inherently bad. They're natural parts of the psyche. We all have them. A mother complex, for instance, can create unhealthy dependency, but also deep nurturing and protection. What defines their impact is our level of awareness. The real issue arises when complexes go unrecognized. That's when they run the show. They push us to repeat unhealthy patterns, stay in toxic relationships, sabotage opportunities, and suffer emotionally. Worst of all, they do this invisibly. We think we're in control, when really we're following an unconscious script. Jungian psychology offers a path, becoming aware of our complexes. Identifying them means getting to know the inner characters living inside us, not to eliminate them, but to integrate them. Because every complex carries more than just pain. It also holds healing potential. Complexes are made of vital psychic energy, and once transformed, they become sources of creativity, empathy, and inner strength. Dreams are one of the best ways to access complexes. In dreams, repressed material shows up symbolically as a threatening figure, a lost child, a collapsing house. These images aren't random. They're messages from the unconscious. Working with them opens a dialogue with our complexes and helps reframe their meaning. Art, writing, meditation, and therapy are also powerful tools for exploring these emotional knots. Because a complex only loses its grip once it's brought into the light of awareness. Jung said, "What we do not face in ourselves, we will meet as fate, and fate, more often than not, is just a complex we didn't resolve." There's an ethical dimension to this work. Facing your complexes is choosing truth over repetition. It means breaking inherited emotional patterns. It's the shift from being a victim of your impulses to becoming the author of your story. It requires humility. The ego hates giving up control, but it also takes courage. The courage to see yourself without masks, to admit there are parts of you that are still hurting. Working with complexes is deep emotional education, a return to the root of our wounds and to the root of our humanity. We're not finished beings. We're psyches in progress, fragmented by past experience, but longing to be whole again. Complexes are the rupture points, but they're also gateways to reconnection. Integrating a complex means learning to hear its message without becoming its wound. It means naming what used to be chaos. It means building bridges where there were once inner gaps. In the end, conscious living doesn't mean eliminating your complexes. It means dancing with them, hearing their voices, honoring their lessons, and slowly turning pain into wisdom. So here's the question. Which inner Voices are still louder than your own will. And what might happen if you finally stop to really listen? In the architecture of the soul outlined by Carl Gustav Jung, there's a meeting point between two seemingly opposite worlds, the conscious and the unconscious. But this isn't just any intersection, it's a living bridge, a dynamic and creative process that Jung called the transcendent function. More than a technical concept, it's a symbolic path, a way toward real transformation of the self. The transcendent function isn't a function in the usual sense. It's not something the mind does automatically. It's a dialectical movement where unconscious content comes into contact with conscious attitudes, generating a third thing, a living symbol, a synthesis that transcends both sides. That's why Jung called it transcendent. It goes beyond duality without denying it. This isn't a passive process. It takes effort and engagement. It asks the ego to face what it usually avoids. Dreams, impulses, images, intuitions, all the material that rises up from the unconscious. The transcendent function doesn't make conflict disappear. It transforms it. It doesn't silence tension. It integrates it. In this way, it's an essentially alchemical process. Jung drew inspiration from Hegel's Dialectic to describe this concept. In Hegel's philosophy, the spirit evolves through the tension between thesis and antithesis, which leads to a synthesis. The transcendent function works similarly. The ego, thesis, clashes with unconscious content, antithesis, and out of that clash, something new emerges. A symbolic synthesis that didn't exist before. It's not just a mix, it's a whole new level of awareness. But while Hegel's process is logical and abstract, Jung's is experiential and symbolic. The synthesis isn't reached through reasoning, it's felt, it's lived through. Dreams, deep insights, creative breakthroughs, or transformative decisions. Each symbol that emerges is the result of tension that was held, not avoided. That's why Jung warned, the transcendent function doesn't work for people looking for shortcuts. It takes surrender, patience, and deep listening. The ego has to soften, but not disappear. The unconscious must be welcomed, but not worshipped. Integration happens only when both are honored. The conscious mind has to learn how to hold paradox, ambiguity, and the unfinished. This process is central to individuation, the journey of becoming whole. The transcendent function is the engine of true inner change. It's not about adjusting to social norms, but about hearing what your soul is trying to reveal. In times of crisis, it becomes a guide, not offering step-by-step answers, but symbolic direction. A clear example of this is in dreams. When someone is facing a deep existential dilemma, dreams often present images that aren't just a replay of the problem or a simple solution, but something new, symbolic, and integrative. That's the unconscious trying to start a dialogue. When the conscious mind listens, reflects, respects, explores, the transcendent function activates, and something new is born. Jung saw this function as the true driver of psychic transformation. When we face inner polarities, reason and emotion, desire and duty, light and shadow, we're not meant to pick a side. We're called to listen to both until something third shows up, the symbol. And for Jung, a symbol isn't a metaphor. It's a living reality that carries psychic energy. It's a bridge, a revelation, a healing force. But this isn't a comfortable road. It pushes us beyond black and white thinking. It challenges our need for control. The transcendent function leads us into the in-between, that symbolic space where no certainty lasts very long. And it's in this fertile emptiness that something truly new can grow. That's why practices like art, meditation, journaling, and active imagination are so powerful. They create the inner space where the transcendent function can do its work. They let the psyche speak freely, without judgment or rush. Jung emphasized, you can't force a symbol. It appears when the tension is held with honesty, Because of that, the transcendent function also has a spiritual side. It's a tool of the self, the deepest and most complete part of the psyche, that helps guide the ego toward wholeness. The self speaks through images that bring opposites together, that unify what once felt broken or at war. The transcendent function is how the self communicates. In today's world of polarization, rigid thinking, and instant answers, this function is more important than ever. It teaches us not to run from inner conflict, but to listen to it as a source of wisdom, to trust that behind the tension, there's a possibility we haven't seen yet. The transcendent function, at its core, is an act of faith in the symbolic power of the soul, a faith that opposites don't need to be erased, they need to be reconciled, that the new doesn't come from rejecting the old, but from consciously meeting it, that the psyche is alive, and if we listen with courage, it knows the way forward. So the question is, where in your life are you stuck between two extremes? And are you willing to listen for the symbol that might emerge between them? Carl Jung was a true explorer of the soul. And like any genuine explorer, he knew that traditional maps are useless when navigating the invisible landscape of the unconscious. For this kind of journey, you need more than rational analysis or clinical observation. You need something alive, not as an escape, but as a bridge. That's where one of his boldest and most transformative practices comes in: active imagination. Active imagination is a technique Jung developed to have a direct dialogue with the unconscious. It's a way of listening symbolically and interacting with inner images, where a person allows themselves to engage, observe, and respond to what the psyche presents in real time. Unlike dreaming, which is passive and involuntary, active imagination is conscious, but not controlling. It's a meeting point between focused awareness and the symbolic flow within. It starts with an image, maybe from a dream, a daydream, or a powerful emotional moment. Instead of analyzing it abstractly, you engage with it. You might draw it, write about it, act it out, or simply let it unfold in a meditative state. What matters is allowing the image to speak, to move, to reveal what it holds. Jung compared this method to a kind of symbolic self-interpretation. Just like a philosopher interprets a text to find meaning, the person practicing active imagination interprets the living symbols that arise from their psyche. But not like someone trying to figure it out, more like someone who's truly listening. Because the soul doesn't want to be solved, it wants to be heard. This symbolic dialogue isn't imaginary in the superficial sense. The word imagination comes from imago, Latin for image, something that appears, that shows itself. The Jungian unconscious doesn't speak in words, it speaks in images. Powerful, layered, living images. When we engage with them, we're not making things up. We're responding to the original language of the soul. The power of active imagination lies in its ability to connect worlds, the rational conscious world with the emotional symbolic world of the unconscious. The space it creates is sacred, a kind of inner arena where the ego encounters inner figures that challenge, provoke, teach, and often heal. This isn't a fantasy game. These encounters can be intense, emotional, even unsettling. Jung warned that anyone starting this process should be ready to meet not just light-filled figures, but also shadows, complexes, and primal archetypes. Active imagination takes courage. It's a descent into your own depths, not to escape, but to transform. In that sense, it's also a spiritual practice, not religious, but deeply connective. It brings us back to our inner center, to the self. It's like meditation in motion, where the symbol isn't something to be dissected and discarded, but something to live with, embody, and honor. The truth that emerges from active imagination isn't just insightful, it's transformational. Contemporary philosophy, especially hermeneutics, echoes this. Gadamer said that interpretation isn't about solving the mystery of a text, but going deeper into it. The same is true for the soul. The image that appears through active imagination isn't a puzzle to crack. It's a voice to listen to with reverence. It holds a piece of the collective unconscious, a reflection of humanity's deeper story expressed through your unique experience. Active imagination is also a powerful antidote to the fragmentation of modern life. In a world where internal time is constantly hijacked by external speed and endless distraction, this practice brings us back to our inner space. It's not just introspection, it's meaning-making, a way for you to reclaim your symbolic presence in the world. You can practice it through writing, drawing, movement, quiet contemplation. What matters is keeping the creative tension between the conscious and the unconscious alive, without trying to force answers. Symbols speak when they're welcomed. They open when they're respected. Jung said that true therapy begins when a person stops seeking answers from outside and begins speaking with their own soul. Active imagination is that conversation, not with a therapist or a guru, but with your own unconscious, which speaks in living images, just waiting to be heard. And this practice teaches us something essential. The soul is dynamic. It's not static or something to be fixed. It moves, it shifts, it creates. And when you truly listen, it guides you in ways that are often surprising and wise. Those who commit to regular encounters with their inner images develop not only self-awareness, but more flexibility, more depth, more presence. At its core, active imagination is a path toward integration, a way of building bridges between the rational and the symbolic, the ego and the self, trauma and creativity. It's a kind of psychic alchemy, where the raw material of the soul is transformed not by explanations, but by presence, listening, and surrender. So the question is, are you ready to listen to the images your soul has been trying to show you? While our waking life keeps us tied to logic, productivity, and linear thinking, dreams take us back to the original landscape of the soul. Carl Gustav Jung was one of the great thinkers who reclaimed the value of dreams, not as random brain activity, but as symbolic expressions of the unconscious. For him, dreams were the privileged language of the deep psyche, a language that doesn't speak in words, but in meaningful images. Jung's understanding of dreams was rooted in a radical perspective. The unconscious isn't just a storehouse of repressed trauma, as Freud believed, but a living, creative, and guiding force. It reveals itself most clearly when the ego loosens its grip, which happens especially during sleep. In dreams, the unconscious speaks, but not in the way the conscious mind expects. It speaks through symbols, metaphors, paradoxes, and archetypal situations. This is what Jung considered a kind of dream knowledge, a symbolic way of knowing. In dreams, truth isn't revealed through arguments, but through images. And those images can't be taken literally. They require interpretation. They ask us to read between the lines, to sense the invisible, to uncover the many layers of meaning held in a single dream scene. For example, dreaming of a house isn't just about a physical space. The house can represent the body, the soul, or the structure of the self. The basement might symbolize the deep unconscious, the attic, the intellect. A fire in the house could point to an inner crisis. It all depends on the context, the emotions felt in the dream, and the current life of the dreamer. Dream interpretation isn't about formulas. It's a living, personal process. To Jung, interpreting a dream is like translating an ancient, sacred language. It's not about decoding fixed meanings, like dream dictionaries try to do, but discovering the personal significance of each image. That's why two people can have the same dream, and it means something completely different to each of them. More than that, dreams don't exist just to reveal problems. They are creative, insightful, and often ahead of the conscious mind. Many times, the unconscious shows us through dreams what the ego can't yet see. It points to possible futures, reveals emerging psychological patterns, warns us about imbalances, and suggests symbolic solutions. It's as if the soul is guiding us, not through commands, but through inner images. Jung also talked about compensatory dreams, which show up when our conscious mind is too one-sided. If someone is overly rational, the dream might bring chaotic or emotional imagery. If someone is caught up in pride, the dream might show them their smallness. The unconscious seeks balance, and the dream is its symbolic correction tool. Then there are big dreams, the ones that aren't about everyday conflicts, but about deeper universal themes and archetypal symbols. These dreams often appear at turning points, during crises or major life changes. Jung saw them as messages from the self, the deepest part of the psyche, trying to connect with the ego. That's what makes dreams not just psychological, but also spiritual. They reconnect us with mystery, with the part of ourselves that's beyond routine, social roles, or cultural conditioning. In dreams, we return to being soul, and the soul speaks in symbols. So why do we forget that? Because modern culture has dismissed dreams. It reduces them to brain static or meaningless byproducts of sleep. We've been taught to trust only what can be measured, explained, or proven. But the soul doesn't work that way. It speaks through intensity, metaphor, beauty. And when we ignore our dreams, we cut off one of the deepest lines of communication we have with ourselves. Reopening that dialogue takes effort. It means writing down your dreams when you wake up, reflecting on their images, feeling their emotional tone, not to decode them in a shallow sense, but to listen. What matters is the symbolic attitude, recognizing that your dreams are trying to tell you something, and that your ego doesn't know everything. Jung believed dreams are like inner dramas performed by the unconscious. Every character, setting, and action has a role, a meaning, an invitation. When we enter that nighttime theater with respect and openness, something changes. Life starts to feel more symbolic, where events aren't just facts, but signs. This kind of dream work can have profound effects. It helps us recognize our inner wounds, integrate repressed parts, connect with archetypes, and, most importantly, it moves us toward individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are. Because dreams don't lie. They show us what the ego tries to hide, and they reveal what we haven't yet become. In ancient philosophy, dreams were seen as messages from the gods. In Jungian psychology, they're messages from the self. In both cases, they're bridges to the unseen. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of modern life is having lost that kind of listening, because the outside world may offer answers, but only your inner world knows the right questions. So the question is, are you listening to what your dreams are trying to tell you? Or are you ignoring the deepest voice of your soul? We live in a world where evil is often seen as something external, something that belongs to someone else. The enemy, the criminal, the distant bad guy. Or, in more idealistic views, evil is reduced to a simple illusion, a mistake in perception, a moral flaw that can be corrected through education or empathy. But Carl Gustav Jung invites us to look deeper and more uncomfortably. Evil is an internal psychological reality. This idea sharply breaks from the rational optimism that shaped much of modern thinking. That tradition holds that humans are essentially good, and that evil comes only from ignorance, social conditions, or corrupt systems. Jung, however, takes a different stance, based on both clinical experience and symbolic insight. Evil lives inside the psyche. It's not just what happens out there, it's also what moves through us on the inside. But what does Jung mean by psychological reality? In his vocabulary, something is psychologically real if it has a real effect on behavior, feelings, symbols, and human destiny. In this view, evil isn't just a social construct or a moral metaphor. It's a living, archetypal force that can show up in dreams, actions, thoughts, and most often in our silence toward the suffering of others. This perspective echoes what we might call a tragic ontology of evil. Tragic, not in a hopeless way, but in the classical Greek sense. The recognition that human life involves unavoidable conflict between opposing forces, and that there's not always a clean, pure, or morally simple solution. The Greeks understood this. Jung brings that ancient wisdom into the modern soul. Psychological evil, for Jung, is closely tied to the shadow, the rejected side of the personality. But he goes further. The shadow might contain morally neutral things that were unfairly repressed, like natural desires or creative potential. Evil, however, shows up when the ego refuses to integrate the shadow and instead projects its darkness onto the outside world. Rather than admitting to its own hate, pride, or greed, a person labels someone else as the problem. This projection of evil is one of the most powerful sources of collective violence. Wars, persecutions, genocides, and fanaticism often begin with the refusal to look at one's own darkness. The other becomes the carrier of the evil the person doesn't want to see in themselves. Jung warned about this mechanism, especially in the context of the 20th century and the horrors of war and totalitarian regimes. But psychological evil doesn't only show up in major historical events. It appears in daily life, in casual cruelty, in the pleasure of humiliating others, in indifference to someone else's pain, in quiet manipulation, in the dehumanization of anyone who thinks differently. Evil doesn't have to be dramatic to be real. It can be subtle, polite, and disguised as virtue. That's why Jung insisted that facing our inner evil is a basic ethical duty. Those who don't recognize their own capacity for harm live in the illusion of being good. And that illusion is dangerous because it makes us morally blind. We believe we're just, but in truth, we're simply unconscious. True, goodness, for Jung, isn't the absence of evil. It's the conscious integration of it. That doesn't mean giving in to destructive urges, but acknowledging them, understanding them, and taking responsibility for them. That's what separates the ethical individual from the moralist. The ethical person holds space for their inner contradictions. The moralist denies them and projects them onto others. This insight also has spiritual implications. Jung saw evil as an archetypal force, present even in symbolic images of the divine. The God who loves everything, but also destroys everything. The archetype of wholeness that includes both light and shadow. Traditional religion splits the cosmos into pure good and pure evil, and in doing so, it fragments the human soul. Jung offers a symbolic spirituality that recognizes this wholeness can only come when light shines into darkness. This path takes maturity. It's easier to live in a world of quick answers where evil is always out there and good is always in here. But that black and white view only feeds the same destructive cycle. Evil doesn't go away when it's denied. It hides, and hidden evil acts with even more power. Accepting evil as a psychological reality is both an act of humility and an act of strength, because only someone who sees their darkness can avoid feeding it. Only someone who faces the abyss within can stop projecting it onto others. Evil that is seen can be contained. Evil that's denied never can. Jung wasn't a pessimist. He was a tragic realist. He believed the human soul could transform. But that transformation must begin with facing what we most fear. In that journey, we are not alone. Symbols, myths, dreams, and archetypes guide us. But the courage to look, that's on us. So the question is, do you have the courage to recognize where evil truly begins? Inside yourself? Individuation isn't a solitary journey. If you value content that goes deep into existence and reveals the soul through symbols, subscribe to the channel and be part of a community walking this path with purpose. For Carl Gustav Jung, the human soul is, above all, a living reality, and as such, it seeks meaning, direction, and integration. But that search doesn't happen only through reason or science. It shows up most strongly in experiences that go beyond the everyday: symbols, myths, dreams, rituals, and deep encounters with mystery. That's where Jung introduces the idea of psychological spirituality, an approach that doesn't reject religion, but reintegrates it as a symbolic language of the self. Unlike dogmatic religious doctrines that demand literal belief, Jung's spirituality focuses on the experience of the sacred. He wasn't interested in proving whether God exists as an external being. Instead, he asked, what does the experience of God mean psychologically? What kind of images does the soul create to express its connection to the absolute? What symbols show up in times of crisis or rebirth? To Jung, religion is an ancient language of the unconscious. It's how the psyche organizes and relates to the sacred. Its myths, rituals, and gods are symbolic expressions of the self, the core and totality of the psyche. When someone dreams of a guiding light or a wise protective figure, it's not a random fantasy. It's the self appearing in religious form. This view sets spirituality free from rigid institutions. In Jung's thought, God isn't an external dogma. It's an inner image. It's the archetype of wholeness, the deep meaning we're all seeking. When that image is lived consciously and symbolically, it brings healing. When it's lived unconsciously or taken literally, it can become oppressive. Jung believed the history of religion reflects human psychological dynamics. The pantheons of ancient gods, full of contradictions, passions, conflicts, and reconciliations, aren't primitive projections, but archetypal representations of the soul. When he studied Christianity, he saw the figure of Christ as an embodiment of the self, a union of divine and human, awareness and suffering, sacrifice and redemption. This idea has deep implications. Spirituality isn't a way to escape the psyche, but a way to enter it with reverence. It's not about transcending the inner world, but learning to live in it as sacred ground. Religious symbols, then, aren't objects of blind belief. They're tools for understanding the soul. In this way, Jung replaces theology with symbolic psychology, but not by rejecting tradition. On the contrary, he invites us to recover religious symbols not as absolute truths, but as expressions of inner truth. The altar isn't only in the church, it's also in your dreams. Prayer isn't just on your lips, it's also in the quiet listening of your unconscious. This approach is especially meaningful today, when many people have distanced themselves from organized religion, but not from the hunger for meaning. The spiritual calling is still alive, but it's looking for new forms. Jung offers a bridge, a spirituality that respects science, embraces subjectivity, and doesn't demand submission, but listening. A spirituality where God can be understood as a living symbol of the self, not an external, controlling, or punishing figure. And this kind of spirituality is also ethical. It requires shadow work, integration of opposites, and personal responsibility. There's no room for spiritual bypassing, where everything is projected onto God and nothing is claimed as your own. Jung said, to be religious in the proper sense means to be in touch with the unconscious. It's not enough to repeat prayers, you have to listen to your soul. That listening often happens during collapse, when everything stable falls apart, when personal myths fail, when the ego is forced to confront its limits. In those moments, the sacred can emerge, not as cheap comfort, but as true transformation. That's when the self speaks, and the psyche answers with symbols of rebirth, light in the darkness, meaning in the pain. Psychological spirituality also teaches that there is no authentic spiritual path without individuation. Seeking God without knowing yourself is just another form of escape. The true spiritual journey, according to Jung, requires deep self-knowledge, internal reconciliation, and a recognition of the sacred within the everyday. There's no enlightenment without shadow, no transcendence without grounding. This spirituality isn't vertical, it's circular. It doesn't lift you out of life. It takes you deeper into it. Every emotion, dream, and inner conflict becomes part of a sacred process of transformation. The temple is in the soul, and the soul speaks in images, the same images preserved by religions for thousands of years. Jung invites us to re-enchant the spiritual experience, not with dogmas, but with living symbols. He doesn't deny the divine. He brings it back to where it began, the human interior as the dwelling place of mystery. In this view, spirituality is no longer separate from psychology. It becomes its highest expression. A fully lived psyche is, in itself, sacred. The question is, are you listening to the symbols your soul uses to speak about God? Or are you living disconnected from the sacred that already lives within you? For centuries, alchemy was misunderstood. Often reduced to an outdated practice of turning lead into gold, it was seen as a historical curiosity or some kind of pre-scientific mysticism. But Carl Gustav Jung saw something deeper. He realized that medieval alchemy wasn't just early chemistry, it was a symbolic language, a mirror of the human psyche in transformation. In his view, alchemy isn't really about metals, it's about the soul. And the alchemical process is a powerful symbol of individuation. In analytical psychology, Jung understood that the ancient alchemists were unknowingly projecting their inner psychological experiences onto physical matter. They weren't just mixing chemicals. They were describing, through symbolic images, the stages of inner development. Fire, dissolution, decay, and coagulation weren't just lab terms. They were phases of the soul's journey toward wholeness. Jung saw this as a unique opportunity to reinterpret alchemical texts as symbolic maps of the psyche. In works like Mysterium Coniunctionis and Psychology and Alchemy, he showed how alchemical symbols, the king, the queen, the dragon, the gold, the Athanor, the furnace, all represent parts of the soul seeking integration. For Jung, alchemy was the symbolic philosophy of inner transformation. This transformation follows a path, and interestingly, it aligns with the process of individuation. In the beginning, there is raw material, the prima materia, which symbolizes the unrefined state of the soul, fragmented, unconscious, full of contradictions. This is the ego before self-awareness. The journey begins when this material is placed in the symbolic furnace of consciousness, the heat of introspection, attention, and transformative suffering. Then come the classic alchemical stages: nigredo, albedo, citrinitas, and rubedo. Nigredo, the black stage, is a period of darkness. Here, you face your shadow, your inner chaos, the symbolic death of the ego. It's the phase of breakdown, confusion, and creative despair. But it's necessary, because it's in the darkness that the soul begins to see. Next comes albedo, the white stage, a period of purification and clarity that follows the dark night of the soul. It's a return to essence, to inner truth, no longer hidden behind masks. Consciousness begins to center itself around something more authentic. Then comes citrinitas, the yellow stage, less often discussed but just as important. This is the rise of inner light, the awakening of symbolic wisdom, the understanding that transformation isn't just personal, it's also spiritual. The soul prepares for the final phase, rubedo, the red stage. This is integration, the inner union of masculine and feminine, the merging of opposites, the crystallization of the self. The philosopher's gold. These stages aren't linear or fixed. They overlap, repeat, deepen. The alchemical journey of the soul is a spiral. Each turn takes you further inward, closer to the core. The ego is slowly refined. The unconscious is brought to light. Transformation doesn't happen through force or willpower. It happens through symbolic heat and psychic time. The alchemist's lab is internal. Each reaction is a lived experience. Each substance is a symbol. Each transformation is a ritual of the soul. The alchemist doesn't work with flasks. They work with emotions, memories, dreams, and imagination. And the Athanor, the sacred. Furnace is your own consciousness, the part of you that holds the process without rushing or abandoning it. Jung saw alchemy as empirical confirmation of what depth psychology had been saying all along. The soul is not a fixed thing. It's a work in progress, a symbolic journey toward wholeness. Alchemy doesn't aim to change the outside world. It aims to change the self. And that kind of transformation requires confrontation, persistence, and surrender. This symbolic lens also protects us from spiritual shortcuts. Instead of chasing instant results, enlightenment, healing, success, alchemy teaches that transformation is slow, symbolic, and often painful. There are no shortcuts. The lead of your personality must be heated, broken down, and purified. Only then can inner gold emerge. And even then, it's not a finished product, but a living quality of the soul. Alchemy reminds us that the psyche speaks in images and that symbols are not decorations. They are tools of the soul. They don't explain, they reveal. They don't simplify, they deepen. To live symbolically is to live with soul, and the alchemist is the one who's learned to read both the world and themselves as sacred texts, filled with metaphors waiting to be lived. More than just a theory, psychological alchemy is a way of life. It's choosing to turn pain into meaning. It's being willing to withstand the heat of transformation. It's knowing that we're not born complete, but we are born with the potential to become whole. Individuation, in that sense, is the soul's great magnum opus. So the question is, what part of you is still raw material? And are you willing to place it in the symbolic furnace of transformation? We live in a world of contrasts, light and shadow, reason and emotion, masculine and feminine, order and chaos. In every part of life, polarity is constant. For many people, this duality seems like a source of conflict, something to be solved by choosing one side over the other. But for Carl Gustav Jung, polarity isn't a flaw. It's an essential structure of the psyche, and the key to inner growth lies in what he called the dialectic of opposites. In philosophy, dialectic is the process of interaction between opposing ideas or forces that, through their tension, give rise to something new. For Jung, this dialectic wasn't just logical, it was symbolic, emotional, and deeply psychological. It doesn't happen at the level of abstract thought, but in the intimate drama of the soul. The psyche is constantly pulled between opposing forces, and the true path to growth isn't to eliminate the tension, but to hold it until a deeper synthesis can emerge. This tension is unavoidable. Human beings by nature carry contradictions within them. We want freedom, but we also want safety. We long for spirituality, but we're tied to the material world. We crave peace, yet hold on to anger. When we try to resolve these tensions by repressing or denying one side, the result is fragmentation. It's like trying to breathe with only one lung, possible, but limiting. Jung offers another way, conscious integration of opposites. It's not about choosing between light and shadow, but recognizing that both are valid parts of the self. Light is clarity, awareness, and direction. Shadow is power, depth, and unacknowledged truth. Only by embracing both can we reach a wholeness that isn't superficial. The same is true for reason and emotion. Reason brings structure, analysis, logic. Emotion brings movement, color, and connection. Societies and systems that favor only one of these create imbalance. Either people become too cold and detached, or too reactive and unstable. True psychological health requires a balance, a conversation between the two. This is more than a psychological idea. It's an ethical stance. Facing our inner opposites means taking responsibility. It means not falling for the comfort of easy polarizations. It means holding space for ambiguity. The ethics of the dialectic of opposites is the ethics of maturity. The ability to say, the other side has something to teach me. My truth is not the whole truth. The world is more complex than I can fully grasp. It's also a way of seeing reality. Jung believed that reality isn't made up of isolated pieces, but of relationships between opposites. Unity doesn't come from sameness, but from integration. Wholeness, by its nature, is paradoxical. And as a person becomes aware of this truth, they move closer to the self, the integrative center of the psyche. Alchemy, which Jung studied deeply, reflects this wisdom in its symbols. The king and queen, the sun and moon, sulfur and mercury, all represent polarities that must be united. The final goal, the conjunctio oppositorum, union of opposites, is the symbol of inner realization. It's not the peace that comes from avoiding conflict. It's the peace that comes from integrating tension. This vision echoes Eastern philosophy too. The Tao, for example, is the path of balance between yin and yang, the feminine and the masculine, dark and light, receptive and active. Taoism doesn't reject opposites, it honors them. It sees them not as enemies, but as partners in the dance of life. Jung saw this and brought it into the heart of Western psychology. To live by the dialectic of opposites is to accept that easy answers are dangerous, that absolute good and absolute evil are rarely found in real life, that every decision includes both gain and loss. That growth comes not from escaping complexity, but from learning to live with it. But this complexity isn't chaos, it's fertile, because it's in that middle space where opposites meet that real creativity is born. The artist who combines technical skill with emotional depth, the leader who mixes strength with compassion, the individual who balances freedom with responsibility. Life becomes deeper when we stop chasing certainty and start holding paradox. Jung wasn't proposing confusion, he was proposing synthesis, a synthesis that doesn't erase differences, but honors them. The dialectic of opposites is an invitation to unity without uniformity. It's the maturity that says, I am light and shadow, I am reason and emotion, I am strength and vulnerability. And it's in that integration that I find my center. In a world that's increasingly polarized, where everything is pushed to extremes or oversimplified, this perspective is more needed than ever, not just as an idea, but as a practice. The inner dialogue between opposites helps us engage in real dialogue with others. Respect for our own complexity teaches us to respect difference in the world. Wholeness isn't a fixed state, it's a living dynamic. Every day, we're called to reconcile opposing forces within us. The psyche is a field of tension. And to live with soul is to live in symbolic relationship with that complexity. So the question is, what opposites inside you are still at war? And what would happen if, instead of picking a side, you listened to both until something new was born? Psychological suffering is often treated like background noise, something that needs to be silenced. Anxiety, anguish, compulsions, emotional blocks. The default response is usually quick relief, escape, or medication. And while those things can be helpful, Carl Gustav Jung invites us to go deeper, to see neurosis not as a mistake to be corrected, but as a message that needs to be heard. For him, neurosis is, at its core, the suffering of a soul that hasn't yet become what it's meant to be. This perspective completely shifts how we understand mental suffering. Jung breaks away from the purely pathological view of neurosis. Instead of seeing it as a mental defect, he saw it as a symbolic symptom, a language of the soul that, when ignored, begins to scream. In this sense, neurosis isn't the problem. It's the psyche's attempt to solve a deeper inner conflict that the ego hasn't yet grasped. The heart of the issue is this: neurosis points to a crisis of meaning. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It's often the result of an internal split between the ego and the self. In other words, between the life someone is living and the life their soul longs to live. Between the path chosen out of fear, convenience, or external expectation, and the path that truly calls from within. Jung saw this as a disruption in wholeness. When essential parts of the psyche are ignored, repressed desires, overlooked talents, unhealed wounds, psychic energy gets stuck. And that energy, which should be flowing toward individuation, instead shows up in distorted ways: chronic anxiety, obsessions, existential dread, or seemingly irrational fears. In other words, neurosis is misdirected life energy, a frustrated attempt by the soul to express itself, blocked by rigid internal structures or the pressure to conform. The soul wants to grow, to integrate, to evolve, but the ego resists. And from that resistance comes pain, comes collapse. This way of seeing things demands a paradigm shift. Instead of fighting neurosis like an enemy, Jung suggests we engage with it like a messenger. What is it trying to say? What part of me is being silenced? What symbols is it carrying? Rather than shutting it down, we need to listen. But this kind of listening isn't passive. It takes courage. Because often, neurosis is pointing toward uncomfortable truths. A relationship that needs to end. A career that no longer fits. A lifestyle that's suffocating. A lie that's become your identity. Neurosis is a distorted mirror reflecting what the ego is too afraid to see. That's why treatment can't just be about getting back to normal. It's not about helping someone adjust to a standard. It's about helping them reconnect with their symbolic center. For Jung, healing is always a return to the self. The goal isn't perfect social adaptation, it's inner fulfillment. Neurosis dissolves when psychic energy starts flowing back toward meaning, and that meaning is always personal. What heals one person might harm another. That's why Jung rejected one-size-fits-all solutions. He saw every patient as a unique world, a symbolic drama looking for resolution. The analyst's job isn't to fix someone, but to help them understand the language of their suffering, and from there, find a new path. This approach has deep ethical implications. First, because it restores dignity to suffering. Psychological. Pain is not a moral failure, not weakness, not hysteria. It's a legitimate expression of a soul in crisis. Second, because it demands responsibility. Listening to your neurosis means owning it. Not in a way that blames, but in a way that allows change. There's also a spiritual side to this view. Neurosis is often a sign that the soul has lost touch with the sacred, with symbols, with depth. Existential emptiness isn't just psychological, it's symbolic. Life without soul is unbearable, and neurosis shouts this truth loud and clear. In that sense, neurosis can be the beginning of a rebirth. If it's listened to with attention, welcomed with humility, interpreted with honesty, it becomes a doorway to individuation. As Jung once said, a neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. And once the real suffering is faced, the neurosis no longer serves a purpose, but it takes time. The soul doesn't rush. Symbolic listening is a slow process. It requires space, containment, and care. It's not about quick fixes. It's about staying with the movement of the psyche, letting the symbols speak, letting the dreams guide, letting the unconscious participate. Neurosis isn't the end. It's the beginning of the journey. It's the soul saying, something needs to change. Something inside me is starving. Look at me. And if that call is answered, what seemed like destruction may actually be transformation. The question is, are you willing to hear what your pain is trying to say? Or will you keep numbing the soul that's simply trying to bloom? To truly understand human culture, it's not enough to look at it through a historical, economic, or sociological lens. We have to go deeper, down into the invisible layers of the collective psyche. Carl Gustav Jung believed exactly that. That culture, at its core, is an expression of the collective unconscious. Art, religion, mythology, rituals, symbols, they all come from a shared ancient source, the soul of the world. By saying that culture is a manifestation of the unconscious, Jung wasn't reducing it to some psychological side effect. In fact, he was elevating it. seeing culture as something that reveals. It's a mirror in which the collective psyche recognizes itself. Every meaningful work of art, every enduring myth, every symbol that survives across generations doesn't just communicate. It unveils something deep within the human soul, rooted in archetypal patterns. Culture is, at its heart, symbolic, aesthetics. Its language isn't logic or instruction, it's emotion, image, and meaning. When we experience art, we're not just seeing one person's expression. We're witnessing something that often even the artist doesn't fully understand. Something rising up from the depths of the collective unconscious. This is especially clear in myths. In every civilization, myths have served to make sense of life. They're not old lies, but symbolic truths. The creation of the world, the birth of the gods, the heroes and monsters. These are inner dramas of the human soul projected into story. They speak to our fears, desires, transformations, struggles, and ideals. That's why Jung saw myths as psychic maps. They guide, teach, protect, but most of all, they reveal. They show how ancient people dealt with shadow, with the sacred, with death, with love, with power. And in doing so, they remind us that these struggles aren't old, they're timeless. We're still living out the same inner dramas, just in modern cultural forms. Religion, in this sense, is also a form of symbolic culture. It arises from our archetypal need for meaning, order, and transcendence. Its rituals, teachings, doctrines, and imagery reflect our attempt to engage with the self, the mysterious center of the psyche. When lived symbolically, religion becomes one of the most powerful ways to connect with the soul. Art, on the other hand, is where this symbolic energy expresses itself most freely. Poems, paintings, music, dance, all of these are ways the unconscious tries to reach the surface. It doesn't matter if the artist knows what they're expressing. Often, they're just the channel, and that's why the work resonates, because it touches something universal. We see ourselves in it. That's also why great works of art stand the test of time. They don't belong to one moment in history. They transcend it. They speak from the collective unconscious, and the unconscious doesn't age. It keeps producing images, keeps dreaming, keeps reaching for form. Culture is the stage where those images come to life. There's a symbolic anthropology to all of this too. Culture isn't just created by individuals. It's a collective body, a shared soul. Every society builds its own myths, rituals, and stories that reflect not just its history, but its psyche. The forms of symbolic language may change, but their purpose remains: to give meaning, to hold chaos, to name the invisible. Jung's analysis of culture was a kind of psychology of civilization. He didn't just study individuals. He studied myths, religions, philosophies, and ancient histories, because he saw in all of them the same symbolic structure that appears in dreams and personal complexes. What shows up in one soul also shows up on a bigger scale in the soul of a people. This perspective has big implications. First, it asks us to look at culture with reverence, not as just entertainment or ideology, but as a symbolic expression of who we are. Second, it teaches us to read culture like a dream, with attention, openness, and sensitivity. Every image, every cultural phenomenon carries a message. The question is, are we listening? Culture also evolves, and with it, so do symbols. Jung saw this with both hope and concern. On one hand, renewal is essential. On the other, there's a risk of symbolic loss. When culture becomes just consumption, distraction, and surface, it loses its psychic function. The symbol becomes a logo. The ritual becomes performance. Art becomes product, and the soul loses its grounding. That's why reclaiming the symbolic dimension of culture is a healing act. It's a return to the source. It's remembering that every song, every story, every meaningful image can be a key, a doorway into the unconscious. And that makes it a doorway into transformation. Culture isn't just what we create, it's what we are when we express, out in the open, what was once hidden within. It's the collective soul taking form. It's the psyche speaking out loud. So, the question is, are you seeing the culture around you as a living symbol of the human soul? Or are you walking past it like someone asleep in front of the sacred? The soul speaks, but it takes silence and listening to hear it. If this video felt like a symbolic mirror for you, subscribe to the channel. Here, every piece of content is an invitation to meet yourself more fully. One of the most subtle and most dangerous mechanisms of the human psyche is projection. Carl Gustav Jung was one of the first thinkers to explore this phenomenon deeply, not just as a psychological glitch, but as a central part of how consciousness interacts with the unconscious. To project is natural. It's something the psyche does. The real problem begins when we don't realize we're doing it. Psychic projection happens when we assign to someone or something outside of us something that actually lives inside us, but that we haven't yet acknowledged, accepted, or understood. This usually involves unconscious material, repressed traits, fears, desires, painful memories, or beliefs that conflict with how we see ourselves. Instead of integrating them, we push them outward, as if they belonged to the outside world or to other people. This is a defense mechanism. It protects the ego from confronting uncomfortable truths, but it also distorts reality. We stop seeing the world for what it is, and instead start seeing it as a reflection of the parts of ourselves we refuse to face. The other becomes a mirror for what we don't want to admit is within us. Projection can be positive or negative. When we idealize someone, we're often assigning them extraordinary qualities that actually exist within us, but remain untapped. The hero, the teacher, the perfect partner. These are often projections of the self or of the anima, animus. That first sense of awe we feel often isn't about the real person. It's about our own inner image reflected back at us. Negative projection, however, is even more common and more destructive. We place our repressed anger, envy, insecurity, or fear onto others. That person becomes dangerous, selfish, arrogant, weak, or bad, when in fact, we're confronting disowned parts of our own shadow. This kind of distortion causes countless personal, social, and even geopolitical conflicts. Intolerance, prejudice, fanaticism, and irrational hatred of those who are different all feed off projection. The enemy becomes necessary so we don't have to face the enemy within. Scapegoats exist because few people are willing to carry the weight of their own darkness. Jung saw projection as a necessary stage in self-development, but not a place to stay stuck. Projecting is human. The problem is being unaware that you're doing it. The task of consciousness is to gradually withdraw these projections and reclaim what's ours. Jung called this the withdrawal of projections. And although it's a demanding process, it's also incredibly freeing. Withdrawing a projection means being able to say, what bothers me so much in that person might also live in me. It means reclaiming the psychic energy we've pushed away. It means finally seeing others for who they are, not as screens we project our inner fantasies or monsters onto. It's both an ethical and symbolic step, stopping the use of the world as a hiding place for the soul. This work is at the core of the individuation process. It forces us to face our own inner complexity, our contradictions, and our truth. When we're triggered by someone, we can ask, why does this affect me so much? What part of me feels threatened? What am I refusing to see? Asking these kinds of questions honestly begins to dissolve the veil of projection. This isn't easy. It often means disillusionment. The person we projected onto stops being a hero or a villain and becomes just a human being. That can hurt, but it also sets us free because the energy we had invested in the projection returns to us, and that energy can then be used to create, to love, and to grow. Art, for example, is a safe space for symbolic projection. Through stories, films, and mythological figures, We can recognize parts of ourselves without having to repress them. Art gives the unconscious a voice, without threatening the ego. That's why art has a powerful therapeutic effect. It helps us see who we are, even when we didn't know. Spirituality, when practiced symbolically and consciously, also helps integrate projections. The divine archetype, for example, may be projected outward onto religious figures, but it can also be seen as a symbol of the self. Then, instead of depending on something outside for meaning, we begin to sense that the sacred also lives. Within, Jung once said that withdrawing projections is one of the hardest tasks of psychological life. It requires taking responsibility for your own shadow. But it's also the beginning of real freedom. When we stop waiting for the other person to change and start working with what's being triggered inside us, we change our lives, not through external control, but through internal awareness. And there's a priceless outcome, the ability to see others with more compassion. When we recognize that we too carry the very things we criticize, that we too struggle with what we judge, we become more human. And from that place of honesty, we can develop a deeper kind of ethics, one that doesn't come from purity, but from clarity. So here's the question. What part of you are you projecting onto someone else? And what part of your soul is asking to be seen? There are moments when everything falls apart. Certainties collapse, relationships break, ideals lose their shine, and the soul sinks into a heavy silence. At first, this psychological collapse may feel like the end, a defeat, an irreversible downfall. But for Carl Gustav Jung, these moments of crisis are actually the beginning of a symbolic renewal. In his view, pain isn't a mistake to be avoided, but a sign that something deeper is trying to be born. This perspective echoes the tragic philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Both understood that true transformation doesn't happen in comfort zones, but through facing loss, absurdity, and inevitable suffering. For Jung, crisis isn't a pathology. It's an archetypal opportunity for the soul to reorganize. It's as if the unconscious is saying, the structure you've built no longer works. Now it's time to rebuild from within. Jung noticed, both in his patients and in himself, that many of the most powerful transformations happen after intense breakdowns, emotional collapses, deep depression, existential losses. As painful as they are, these experiences crack open the ego's armor. And through those cracks, the unconscious begins to emerge with more force, symbolic images, revealing dreams, identity crises, and encounters with the shadow. This is where Jung's philosophy becomes deeply tragic, in the best sense of the word. Not tragic as in pessimistic, but as in the classical Greek understanding, the recognition that human life is marked by unsolvable tensions, unavoidable pain, and symbolic deaths that are part of becoming. There is no true transformation without loss, no growth without rupture. But Jung goes further than simply acknowledging pain. He believed that within every crisis lies a creative potential, something that must die so something else can be born. When understood symbolically, collapse is the breakdown of an identity that no longer serves the wholeness of the person. The soul, suffocated by obligations, masks, and idealizations, finally explodes, not from weakness, but from too much repressed potential. This process is deeply alchemical. In alchemy, which Jung studied extensively, there's a stage called nigredo, the black work. It's when the soul's raw material dissolves into darkness, confusion, chaos. It's the symbolic death of what was, but it's also the beginning of real transformation. Without nigredo, there is no rubedo, no rebirth of the inner gold. Crisis, then, is this dark, chaotic, but absolutely necessary phase. And here's the hardest part. It can't be rushed. The soul has its own timing. The psyche must fall apart before it can come together again. That's why trying to fix suffering quickly, through denial, distraction, or suppression, often just delays the process and makes it more painful. Jung proposes an ethic of symbolic listening in the midst of crisis. Instead of asking, "How do I get out of this?" the the better question becomes, what is this trying to show me? What parts of my identity are falling apart? What values need to be re-examined? What images are showing up in my dreams? What long-forgotten feelings are trying to emerge? This kind of listening is both reverent and brave. Nietzsche, with his ideas of eternal return and will to power, had a similar view. For him, the person who embraces pain and says yes to life, even at its cruelest, becomes truly creative. The free spirit, in Nietzsche's words, is the one who turns a fall into flight. Jung, though less radical and more symbolic, shared this idea. The soul becomes whole only after walking through its own inner hell and returning with new light. That light isn't a final answer. It's a new posture, a new axis. Something internal reorganizes, and the person stops being who they were, becoming who they truly are. Not through a rational choice, but through an archetypal need to align with the self, the symbolic center of the psyche. That's why Jung said, where there is fear, there is also the task. What scares us in crisis is usually exactly what needs to be transformed, and what falls apart is often what was already dead. We just didn't realize it yet. In that sense, pain isn't destructive, it's revealing. It shows us that something needs to be born, and that the old can no longer hold the truth of who we are. Crisis also has a spiritual dimension. Yes, it breaks the ego down, but in doing so, it opens space for the symbolic sacred. Many people reconnect with meaning, art, inner life, and depth through pain. Psychological collapse is often the soul's way of calling us to live more authentically, more symbolically, more truthfully, and that's where renewal begins. Not as a return to what was, but as the emergence of something new. A new center, a new story, a new way of being in the world. The person who goes through a crisis with symbolic awareness doesn't come out the same. They come out more whole. So, the question is your crisis asking for an ending or for a rebirth? And are you willing to listen to what's trying to emerge? Deep spirituality doesn't begin in temples, scriptures, or public rituals. It begins within. For Carl Gustav Jung, this inner experience is the true core of human religiosity. He called it inner religion, a form of spirituality that doesn't depend on dogma, hierarchy, or external belief, but on a living, symbolic relationship with the divine within. Throughout history, humanity has tried to represent the divine through images, myths, doctrines, and symbols. Jung acknowledged the value of all that, but he took it a step further. He said that the archetype of God is not an external, objective being. It's a structuring image within the collective unconscious. He linked it to the archetype of the self, the organizing, unifying center of the psyche. Saying that God is an archetype of the self doesn't mean reducing the divine to psychology. On the contrary, it elevates psychology to its deepest symbolic and existential level. Jung didn't deny the existence of God as a metaphysical reality. He simply reframed the question. For him, what matters more than asking whether God exists is understanding how the image of God acts within the human soul, as a symbol of ultimate meaning, wholeness, and inner transformation. This inner God is not moralistic or institutional. It doesn't belong to any one religion. It can take Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, pagan, or even undefined forms. What matters isn't the name, it's the symbolic function. When experienced religiously, the self is what moves the soul toward its center, toward wholeness, toward reconciling opposites. God, then, isn't a figure of control, but a guiding presence. This kind of inner religiosity is a powerful alternative to external religion that's built on rules and obedience. Jung clearly saw the risks of a spirituality that becomes rigid and dogmatic, where the individual loses contact with the living symbol and becomes trapped in empty belief. For him, the sacred isn't found in sacred words, but in the symbolic experience they awaken. A verse that doesn't touch the soul is just dead text. A symbol that becomes literal loses its power to transform. Inner religion demands listening, not to external sermons, but to the voice of your own soul, especially through dreams, creative impulses, and moments of deep silence. The self speaks in those moments, not with words, but with images full of energy, mystery, and meaning. In this way, Jung redefined what it means to have faith. Faith isn't about subscribing to a list of beliefs. It's about trusting the symbolic wisdom of the soul. It's letting the self guide you, even when reason hesitates. It's holding the tension between the known and the unknown, between the ego and the self, between doubt and longing. Faith, then, isn't certainty. It's a living relationship with the sacred inside us. This relationship transforms everything. The person who recognizes their symbolic nature no longer lives only outwardly. They begin to seek alignment with their inner truth. Their choices, values, and relationships stop being imposed from the outside and begin to emerge from within. This is the heart of Jung's spiritual ethics, acting from the self, not just from a socially conditioned ego. And there's something deeply healing in this. Many people carry religious trauma, wounds caused by moralism, repression, or exclusion in the name of God. Inner religion doesn't erase those wounds by denial. It heals them through reinterpretation. It shows us that the image of God never belonged to a single institution. It belongs to the soul of every human being and is expressed uniquely in every life. At this point, inner religion aligns closely with mystical traditions, which have always sought direct experience of the divine. Christian mystics, Sufis, Kabbalists, Zen Buddhists all speak of an experience that goes beyond words, beyond form. Jung saw in these traditions a strong resonance with his own path, the path of individuation as a spiritual journey. In this, context to individuate is also to become religious in the deepest sense, to reconnect with the self, with the symbol, with the center. Inner religion doesn't divide psychology and spirituality. It unites them in a single process of transformation, because ultimately, what the soul longs for is to rediscover the sacred within. But this journey requires letting go. It means releasing the images of God that were projected outward. It means accepting that truth doesn't come ready-made. It means holding space for the emptiness, the silence, the dark night of the soul. And paradoxically, it's in that symbolic desert that the living image of God may emerge, not as dogma, but as inner revelation. And this revelation doesn't need a grand stage. It shows up in quiet coherence, in silent choices, in integrity that grows without fanfare. The inner God doesn't shout, it whispers, and only those who quiet the ego can hear it. So the question is, do you search for God outside because you're afraid to find God within? Or are you ready to let the image of the self awaken true spirituality in your soul? The kind of knowledge that transforms isn't just information, it's awakening. If this video stirred something in you, subscribe. Let's keep turning wisdom into a life well lived. Many people think of personal growth as a straight road, paved with certainty, peace, and harmony. They expect inner evolution to bring constant clarity, calm, and the absence of struggle. But Carl Gustav Jung revealed a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. Real growth requires inner conflict. The tension between opposites within the soul isn't an obstacle to maturity, it's the very foundation of it. For Jung, the psyche isn't a fixed structure, it's a dynamic field where opposing forces are constantly at play. Reason and emotion, desire and duty, instinct and ethics, light and shadow, all of these polarities live within us, and they don't always get along. Often they clash, but that clash isn't a problem. It's the engine that drives the process of individuation. Individuation, as Jung defined it, is the journey of becoming who you truly are, not who you were taught to be or who you pretend to be. And that process requires facing your inner tensions. There is no path to authenticity without passing through the paradoxes of your own being. Conflict is the symbolic fire that burns away illusion and reveals your essence. So why is inner conflict so transformational? First, it reveals the soul's complexity. The ego tends to believe it's unified, rational, and in control, but conflict shows us we are many. There are voices inside us that disagree, desires that pull in opposite directions, parts of ourselves that contradict each other. That multiplicity isn't weakness, it's living depth. When we deny conflict, we suppress entire parts of ourselves. The result is stagnation, anxiety, numbness. But when we hold the conflict with symbolic awareness, something new can emerge. Jung called this the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to generate a creative synthesis from the tension between opposites. It's not a logical solution, it's a symbolic transformation. This is a non-linear, dialectical process. It's not about fixing the conflict, but listening to it deeply until a new perspective arises. It's like a bridge that only appears once both sides are acknowledged. Real growth happens not when we fight the tension, but when we learn to live within it. This view has deep existential implications. Because accepting conflict as part of development means accepting incompleteness as part of maturity. We don't grow by eliminating doubt, but by learning to carry it. We don't become stronger by silencing our inner opposites, but by allowing them to speak. In practice, this means accepting that we can love and hate at the same time, that we can want to leave and stay, that we can crave change and fear it. Conflict isn't a sign of moral failure. It's a sign of psychological depth. Only people who are fully alive experience contradiction. Only those who seek truth face dilemmas. Jung said, "Inner conflict is always a demand for wholeness. The soul wants to grow, but to do that it needs space. And space only opens up when our inner opposites stop fighting unconsciously and start being integrated consciously. So conflict isn't war, it's a tense, necessary conversation. In mythology, the great heroes always face inner dilemmas. They're not one-dimensional, they struggle, they wrestle with their contradictions. And that struggle is what changes them. It's the same with the psyche. Myths aren't just old stories, they're symbolic maps of our inner battles. Philosophy also understood this. Heraclitus said, "War is the father of all things." Not literal violence, but the creative tension between forces. Hegel gave us the dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Jung brought that same idea into the soul. We don't grow in spite of tension, we grow because of it. And that brings an important ethical idea, the ethics of symbolic holding. It's not about forcing peace, but holding the tension until it reveals its meaning. This requires maturity because the ego wants to fix, escape, avoid, but the soul wants to listen, integrate, and transform. This stands against the culture of quick fixes. In a world of instant answers, inner tension is seen as weakness or error. But Jung reminds us that the soul doesn't move at the speed of convenience. It moves at the speed of symbol. And symbols need time, silence, and depth to unfold. So when you're in conflict, ask yourself, what is this dilemma trying to teach me? What parts of me are meeting or clashing? What new meaning might be born from this symbolic chaos? Conflict isn't a black hole. It's a psychological womb where something new can be formed. The turning point comes when we stop seeing conflict as failure and start seeing it as fertility, as an essential part of becoming whole. Growth isn't peace, it's a crossing. And every crossing means facing forces that collide, but can also complement each other. So the question is, are you running from your inner tension? Or are you willing to go through it to find out who you really are? Western tradition, especially since the Enlightenment, has elevated reason as the only valid path to knowledge. Thinking, analyzing, proving. These became the pillars of understanding. But Carl Gustav Jung dared to take a different path. He suggested that truth doesn't come only from reason, but also from the unconscious. It's a kind of knowing that doesn't arise from logical analysis, but from symbolic revelation, knowledge that isn't a formula, but a lived experience of meaning. Jung's approach is essentially a symbolic gnoseology, a way of knowing, grounded in inner experience, in dialogue with the unconscious, and in interpreting symbols. For Jung, the unconscious isn't just a storage space for repressed trauma or desire, as Freud thought. It's alive, creative, and deeply structured. It produces dreams, images, intuitions, and insights that guide and expand consciousness. The key here is understanding that the unconscious, as Jung saw it, isn't irrational. It's beyond rational. It doesn't oppose reason. It transcends it. It speaks an older, deeper, more subtle language, the language of symbols. And symbols, unlike concepts, don't explain. They reveal. They don't simplify. They deepen. They don't give final answers. They offer mysteries that transform. This symbolic knowledge shows up in many ways. In a dream that touches you deeply, even if it doesn't make sense. In an image that keeps repeating itself until you finally pay attention. In a gut feeling that senses something before it happens. In a piece of art that moves you without needing explanation. These are all forms of original knowing, not produced by effort, but flowing from the spontaneous movements of the soul. Symbolic gnosis asks for a different attitude than standard rational thinking. It's not about controlling or dissecting. It's about letting yourself be moved. You have to listen, reflect, make associations, and respect the rhythm of the image. As Jung said, symbols aren't invented, they're found. And what's found isn't a product of the mind, it's a gift from the unconscious. Why trust the unconscious? Because it holds a wisdom the ego alone doesn't have. It's shaped not only by personal experience, but also by deeper layers. The collective unconscious, archetypes, the symbolic memory of humanity. When the unconscious speaks, it carries more than just your own story. It carries a universal one. That's why dreams, when taken seriously, don't just show current conflicts. They often point toward future possibilities. They warn, guide, correct, and enlighten. They're messages from the self, the unifying center of the psyche, using the unconscious as a channel. In that sense, dreaming is a way of knowing, and interpreting dreams is translating that knowledge into transformation. Art, too, is a source of symbolic gnosis, not in a technical way, but in how it touches truths that can't be spoken. A poem, a painting, a piece of music can reveal parts of the soul that rational language will never reach. Jung saw this clearly in the lives of artists who didn't create from logic, but from deep connection to the creative unconscious. This kind of knowledge also lives in intuition, the immediate direct perception that bypasses reason. For Jung, intuition was one of the four main functions of consciousness. And when it's aligned with the self, it becomes a compass for life, able to guide choices based on something the mind hasn't grasped yet, but the soul already knows. Jung's appreciation for the unconscious as a source of knowledge doesn't reject reason. He never asked us to abandon logical thinking. Instead, he invited us to complement it with symbolic listening, to balance technical knowledge with deep wisdom, to let knowing be not just information, but transformation. This view echoes ancient spiritual traditions. The Oracle of Delphi, shamanic rituals, the sacred texts of major religions, all are rooted in the belief that truth doesn't just come from the mind, but from a deeper place. Gnosis, in its original sense, is lived, felt, revealed, knowing. Jung simply brought this timeless wisdom into modern psychology. By doing that, he offered us a new relationship with truth, one that doesn't demand certainty, but invites movement. One that doesn't end with definitions, but begins with symbols. One that doesn't try to control life, but enters into dialogue with it. When treated with respect, the unconscious doesn't lead to delusion, it leads to the center. There's also an ethical dimension here, the ethics of inner listening. In a world obsessed with productivity and outer validation, listening inward is radical. It means choosing to enter the symbolic silence of the soul and allowing it to show us what logic alone never could. It means honoring the older intelligence that lives in us and realizing that to ignore it is to disconnect from ourselves. So the real question is, have you been relying only on reason, or are you ready to listen to the symbolic wisdom rising from your unconscious? Myths have always fascinated humanity. Since the earliest times, stories of gods, heroes, monsters, and hidden worlds have accompanied people across all cultures. But for Carl Gustav Jung, myths are more than just ancient stories or outdated beliefs. They are symbolic expressions of the human psyche, archetypal representations of the inner journey each person experiences in their path towards self-awareness. Jung didn't see myth as just a cultural invention. He understood it as a symbolic language born from the collective unconscious. In other words, myths are living metaphors that narrate the core psychological processes of the human soul. They speak of the battle between light and shadow, of loss and reintegration, of symbolic death and rebirth, all universal themes we encounter in personal growth. Looking at myths, Jung recognized that behind mythical figures are the foundational archetypes of the psyche, the great mother, the wise old man, the hero, the sovereign father, the anima, the trickster. These figures appear in every mythology across the world, wearing different cultural clothing but playing similar roles. They're not simply made-up characters, but symbolic expressions of patterns shared by all of humanity. This makes myth a kind of mirror, not a flat mirror, but a symbolic one, deep and reflective. It doesn't show who we are on the surface, but who we are deep inside in our oldest and most authentic self. Myths don't explain outer reality. They reveal the inner movements of the soul, its fears, desires, and rites of passage. That's why Jung saw myths as a form of symbolic philosophy, of culture and language. They show how different societies have organized their experience of the world using psychological images. Creation myths, how the world began. Myths of the gods, how divine forces emerged. End times myths, how it all might end. These aren't just stories, they're symbolic attempts to give shape to the mystery of existence. More than that, myths work as symbolic systems of orientation. They teach, protect, and offer structure. A creation myth reveals not just the origin of the cosmos, but of consciousness. A hero myth isn't just about extraordinary feats. It's about the development of individuality through overcoming inner darkness. In the end, the hero represents the ego, one that must die and be reborn in order to become whole. This symbolic reading of myth also protects us from a modern trap, taking myths too literally. When myths are treated as historical facts, they lose their symbolic power and become rigid dogmas. Jung warned against this. For him, the value of a myth isn't in whether it's factually true, it's in its symbolic truth, its ability to speak to the unconscious and spark inner transformation. Contemporary culture, even with all its technology, still runs on myths. They're just less conscious. The myth of productivity, the myth of endless progress, the myth of individual success, the myth of romantic love as salvation. All of these are archetypal narratives shaping our collective imagination. The difference is, because we don't recognize them as myths, we live them unconsciously and often feel trapped by them. Recognizing a myth is the first step towards symbolic freedom. It's the moment we realize the stories we live by can be reinterpreted, that we don't have to remain tragic heroes or helpless victims. We can change the roles we play. In that sense, myth isn't a prison. It's a key. Art plays a vital role in this process. Film, literature, music, painting, all are places where myth continues to live. Archetypes still show up in new forms: the modern hero, the inner villain, the anti-hero's journey. And when we feel deeply moved by these stories, it's not just entertainment. we're experiencing our own psychic drama in symbolic form. That's why Jung believed that understanding myth is a powerful form of self-knowledge. When we identify with the hero's journey, the crossing of the desert, or the dragon to be faced, we're really recognizing internal structures that need integration. Myth gives us language to name the invisible, and naming is the first step toward transformation. This symbolic view of myth also brings depth back to language itself. Because myth doesn't just describe the world, it shows how the world is lived through the soul. It's metaphor in motion, truth pulsing through images, meaning that can't be reduced to facts. When we listen to myth with symbolic attention, something inside us wakes up. Because myth speaks about us. In the end, Jung's symbolic philosophy reminds us, we are not rational beings who occasionally experience symbols. We are symbolic beings who sometimes use reason. Symbols are our first language, and myth is the body of that language. To ignore it is to cut the soul off from its oldest way of speaking. So the question is, what myths have you been living without realizing it? And what might happen if you began to live them consciously? In a world where morality is often judged by visible behavior, social conformity, or adherence to external rules, Carl Gustav Jung offers a radically different and liberating perspective. For him, true morality doesn't come from blind obedience, but from the inner confrontation with one's own shadow. It's not conformity that makes someone ethical, but symbolic awareness of their own moral struggles. This is a major shift in perspective. Conventional morality relies on external rules, commandments, laws, codes of conduct. Its focus is on behavior, on what can be seen. Jungian morality, on the other hand, is rooted in the inner process of individuation, where ethics is lived as an authentic movement of the soul, a constant listening to the tension between the ego and unconscious impulses. Jung believed that we are not born ethical. We become ethical, and becoming ethical takes more than formal education or moral instruction. It requires a journey of self-confrontation, where the individual must look inward and face not only their values, but also their contradictions, denied impulses, and capacity to cause harm. In this sense, morality isn't a shield, it's a personal crossing. The heart of this deeper ethics lies in the shadow. The shadow, as we've seen, is everything the conscious mind has rejected. Impulses, desires, memories, traits the ego found unacceptable, but the shadow doesn't go away. It acts. And when it's not acknowledged, it acts behind the scenes. What appears to be moral behavior may actually be hiding arrogance, fear, or vanity. The moralist often hides what they haven't, yet integrated. That's why Jung warned, it's not enough to appear ethical. You have to be honest with yourself, and honesty requires the courage to look where it hurts. In the jealousy we deny, the envy we project, the small daily acts of aggression, the desires we condemn in others but secretly carry ourselves. Facing the shadow is the beginning of true ethics. This inner ethics doesn't rely on fixed formulas. It doesn't operate through absolute rules, but through symbolic discernment. Every moral situation requires listening, reflection, and presence. A person who lives this kind of morality doesn't act to please or avoid punishment. They act because, deep inside, they know what must be done, even if it's misunderstood by others. This mindset is demanding. Living with symbolic integrity often means going against the collective. Conventional morality may applaud behavior that betrays one's inner truth. Symbolic morality, however, demands loyalty to the soul, even at the cost of external approval. It's an ethic born from silence, dreams, and symbols, and expressed in actions aligned with the process of individuation. But make no mistake, this symbolic morality isn't moral relativism. It doesn't say anything goes if it feels authentic. In fact, it's stricter than conventional moral codes because it's not satisfied with appearances. It demands clarity. It asks that you know what you feel, what you want, what you fear, and still choose what's necessary for the soul's growth. That choice almost always involves tension, because the true ethical path is never comfortable. It's not where the ego wants to go, it's where the self points, even if the ego resists. The tension between I want and I must doesn't disappear with easy answers. It must be carried until a third path emerges, an action that aligns with the whole of who you are. Morality as an inner process is also deeply personal, not in the sense of isolation, but of uniqueness. What's ethical for one person may not be for another, not because values change with the wind, but because each soul has its own symbolic task. What matters is the honesty of the journey, not the uniformity of the outcome. This idea echoes the tragic ethics of ancient Greek drama. In Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides, characters aren't good or bad. They're divided, complex, and in conflict. Tragedy shows the difficulty of choosing between two rights or two wrongs. Jung draws on this wisdom. The real moral dilemma isn't between good and evil, but between competing loyalties within the soul. Jung's approach to ethics also has a spiritual dimension. As someone becomes more integrated, they move closer to the self. And the self, as we've seen, is the symbolic center of wholeness that transcends the ego. Living ethically, then, isn't just doing good. It's becoming whole, integrating opposites, healing wounds. It's a path of deep transformation. We live in a culture that values performance morality, polished words, public gestures, shows of virtue. But the soul knows when it's being betrayed. True morality doesn't prove itself through speeches. It shows up in the quiet acts, in how we treat those who can't repay us, in staying true to our values when no one is watching, in how we deal with our own shadow. The question is, does your sense of ethics come from the outside or from facing what's most honest and raw inside you? Every step towards self-awareness is sacred. If you felt this video was one of those steps, subscribe to the channel and continue this journey with us. The soul blooms in company. On the journey of self-discovery, we often chase the idea of completeness as a promise of stability, of final enlightenment, of total harmony. But Carl Gustav Jung offers a more subtle and deeply realistic perspective. Wholeness is an ideal, not a destination. The self, the symbol of unity and inner integration, is a guiding force throughout life, but never something we fully attain. It's what Jung called an asymptotic ideal, something we pursue, but that always remains just out of reach. This idea is central to analytical psychology. For Jung, the process of individuation, the path of becoming your true self, is guided by the pursuit of the self. But the self isn't an identity to be achieved or a fixed state to arrive at. It's a symbol of psychic totality, a kind of inner compass that draws the ego toward the integration of opposites, the healing of fragmentation, and the experience of meaning. But this integration is never complete. The human psyche is complex, fluid, full of unresolved tensions. There will always be unconscious parts not yet integrated, unknown aspects of ourselves, pieces of the soul still forming. And that's not a failure. It's how we're built. The self is like the North Star. It guides the way, orients our direction, but it's never fully touched. It's the symbolic horizon of the soul. This understanding brings with it a kind of ethical humility. A person who lives guided by the self doesn't believe they're perfect or seek perfection. They live in constant openness to what is new, unfamiliar, and unfolding within. It's an ethic of becoming, not arriving, a posture of ongoing, listening, where every crisis, every symbol, every dream has something to reveal, and always will. Jung saw this incompleteness as fertile, not frustrating. It's the lack of finality that keeps the soul in motion. Wholeness isn't a finish line, it's a rhythm. The self pulses like a quiet calling, and that call sustains the journey. This idea of asymptotic wholeness also protects against a common danger: inflation. The ego, when it experiences moments of insight or temporary integration, might believe it has arrived, understood everything, or reached enlightenment. But that illusion is dangerous. It stops the process, freezes growth, and breeds a kind of spiritual arrogance that cuts us off from our own shadow. Jung was clear: the closer we get to wholeness, the more we realize how fragmented we still are. The real sign of maturity is not certainty. It's the awareness of our own limitations. A wise person is someone who knows how much they still don't know. That awareness keeps the ethic of process, of humility, of deep listening alive. This asymptotic ideal also has an ontological dimension. It's not just a psychological view, it's a world view. It suggests that reality itself is unfinished, that meaning is always unfolding, and that truth is symbolic and open, not fixed or absolute. Life, from this perspective, isn't an equation to be solved, but a text to be continuously interpreted. This approach stands in direct contrast to reductionist thinking, which tries to explain everything with formulas, certainties, or rigid models. The psyche, like reality, is symbolic, layered, and paradoxical, and the self, as an asymptotic ideal, reminds us that any attempt to fully grasp the whole will fall short. But that very failure is what keeps us seeking. That means accepting that we are always in transition, never fully good or bad, never fully healed or broken. We are mixed, we are ambiguous, we are tension in motion, and the ethic that grows from this truth is one of presence, responsibility, and ongoing reflection. Inner growth, then, is not about perfection. It's about symbolic sensitivity to what's still missing. The true sage keeps learning. The true healer keeps healing. Wholeness is not a trophy. It's a direction, and every step toward it, even the imperfect ones, matters. This vision is also freeing. It lets us let go of the tyrannical demand for perfection that often paralyzes or wounds us. We can accept our contradictions, our flaws, our unfinished parts, not as failures, but as essential parts of the process. The soul doesn't want us to be perfect. It wants us to be real, and truth is always partial, always evolving. Seeing wholeness as something we pursue but never fully reach also invites us to look at others with more compassion, because if we're all in process, no one can be judged for not being there yet. We all carry shadows, dilemmas, contradictions. Recognizing that is the first step toward empathy. Jung didn't offer a model of the perfect human being. He offered a symbolic path of continuous transformation, a journey where every experience, every conflict, every symbol, every encounter becomes part of the movement toward the self. And that path, because it's asymptotic, never ends. The question that remains is, are you chasing a form of completeness that traps you, or are you willing to walk humbly toward the kind of wholeness that sets you free? In most medical and social discussions, psychosis is seen as a mental breakdown, a break from reality that needs to be suppressed, fixed, or numbed. Carl Gustav Jung, while not denying the seriousness of psychosis, offered a broader and more human-centered view. He saw psychosis as a raw expression of the unconscious, a disorganized eruption of archetypal content, a kind of symbolic delusion that, while chaotic, carries an unrecognized truth from the soul. This perspective doesn't romanticize psychosis. Jung understood, with clinical clarity and compassion, the real dangers involved. The suffering is real, the disconnection is painful, and reality can become deeply distorted. But he also saw that behind the psychic fragmentation, there was often an unconscious attempt by the soul to reorganize itself, even if in a confused, intense, or destructive way. For Jung, psychosis is marked by an invasion of the conscious, mind by the collective unconscious. In a healthy psyche, there's a kind of boundary between the ego and the unconscious. But in psychosis, that boundary collapses. The person is no longer the center of their own awareness. Instead, they're overwhelmed by images, voices, and symbols that pour in without order or filter. It's as if the collective unconscious has taken the stage, with no director, no script, no structure. These images aren't random. They are raw, unprocessed archetypes, powerful symbolic patterns that surface without the usual process of inner reflection or symbolic interpretation that we see in individuation. The psychotic person doesn't dream these symbols, they live them. They don't interpret them, they become them. A delusion of grandeur may express the inflated hero archetype. A feeling of persecution might reflect the shadow archetype, being projected outward. That's why Jung saw psychosis as a kind of phenomenology of delusion, an inner experience that, while disorganized, still follows a symbolic logic. Delusions aren't just symptoms of illness, they're a kind of language. A language that has lost the structure of the ego but still carries archetypal truth, ancestral wounds, and deep inner conflicts that need recognition. By listening to psychotic patients through a symbolic lens, Jung noticed that many were unconsciously trying to live out an archetypal journey, a chaotic initiation, a descent into the underworld of the soul without guidance or inner structure. Without a strong ego to hold it together, the journey becomes fragmented and dangerous. That's why psychosis to Jung is a failed attempt at individuation. The self is trying to emerge, but the ego isn't ready to contain it. The symbol is trying to rise, but there's no psychic ground for it to take root. Archetypal energy is flooding in, but there's no symbolic channel for it to be integrated. This understanding has profound implications for therapy. Instead of treating someone with psychosis only as a set of symptoms, Jung encourages us to recognize the symbolic side of their experience. This doesn't mean validating delusions as literal truths, but understanding them as expressions of archetypal meaning. A patient who believes they've been chosen by God might be expressing a deep call towards symbolic reintegration, even if they lack the structure to process it. This symbolic listening doesn't replace medical care, it deepens it. It allows us to see the person behind the symptoms, to see the soul trying to speak, even if the message is distorted, to see the symbol trying to be born, even if it's hidden in chaos. Psychosis becomes more than just a breakdown. It's a sign of an archetypal emergency that hasn't been understood. Jung was one of the first to say that, under certain conditions, a delusion could contain the seed of symbolic healing. He, himself, in his own intense encounters with the unconscious, experienced powerful tension between reason and archetypal image. But by holding that tension with awareness, he was able to turn chaos into symbol, and symbol into meaning. So psychosis can be both a danger and a possibility. Yes, there is the risk of collapse, but there is also the potential for transformation if there is structure, symbolic listening, and care. The role of the therapist in this context is to help rebuild the bridge between ego and unconscious, to help the patient interpret their images, reframe their story, and find meaning in what once felt like noise. This Jungian approach also has cultural value. In a world that often fears or rejects those who are different, Jung invites us to see psychosis not as absolute failure, but as a symbolic cry for understanding, recognition, and reintegration. Madness, in many cases, may be a desperate attempt to make sense of something, and should be met with humanity, not just fear. In that way, psychosis becomes a symbolic reminder. The human soul is both fragile and powerful. Truth doesn't live only in logic. It lives in symbols. And delusions, even when disfigured, can carry fragments of deep meaning if we know how to listen with the reverence they require. So the question that remains is, in a world that fears delusion, are we ready to hear the symbol that hides behind the madness? Since the dawn of modern thought, science and religion have often followed separate, even opposing, paths. Science seeks facts, methods, and evidence. Religion seeks meaning, mystery, and the absolute. Many have only seen conflict between the two, but Carl Gustav Jung saw something deeper. the possibility of reconciliation between science and spirit through symbolic psychology. He wasn't trying to merge them or ignore their differences, but to bring them into meaningful dialogue within a broader framework where both reason and soul are respected. Jung recognized the incredible advances modern science had brought to our understanding of the material world. It uncovered the laws of physics, healed diseases, and expanded the boundaries of knowledge. But in doing so, he believed, we had forgotten the soul. The human spirit, with its existential questions, symbolic needs, and longing for transcendence, had been pushed aside as irrelevant or irrational. Technical knowledge grew, but inner meaning diminished. Religion, on the other hand, while still holding powerful symbols, had lost credibility for many due to its ties to rigid dogma, literal interpretations, and institutional control. To many, scientists and thinkers, it came to seem like outdated superstition, no match for the clarity and precision of science. The result was an epistemological split. On one side, knowledge without soul. On the other, faith without clarity. Jung offered a third way. Psychology as a bridge between science and spirit. Analytical psychology, in particular, deals with symbols, the unconscious, and the subjective meaning of experience. It can study religious experience without needing to prove or disprove the literal existence of God. It recognizes religious symbols as valid expressions of the human psyche, with real effects on behavior, mental health, ethics, and identity. In building this bridge, Jung never abandoned science. He remained grounded in empirical observation, clinical practice, and psychological analysis. But he expanded what we consider empirical to include symbolic images, dreams, myths, and archetypes, things that can't be measured in a lab but can be deeply felt, described, and studied with rigor. For Jung, inner experience was just as worthy of investigation as anything else. At the same time, Jung reclaimed spiritual language without falling into dogma. He wrote that religion is an attitude of the soul toward mystery, and this symbolic attitude, he believed, is essential for psychological health. Human beings aren't just bodies and minds, we are also spirit. And by spirit, Jung didn't mean a theological concept, but a symbolic dimension of experience where the self, the guiding center of wholeness, emerges. Reuniting science and spirit doesn't mean one should dominate the other. It means recognizing that each speaks to different, but complementary aspects of reality. Science explains the world. Spirit gives it meaning. Science deals with cause. Spirit deals with purpose. One asks, how? The other asks, why? This perspective echoes ancient philosophical traditions, especially Hermetic thought, which taught that as above, so below, the outer world reflects the inner world, and vice versa. Real knowledge doesn't divide reality, it unites it. Jung also found inspiration in Eastern traditions, which often blend science and spirit seamlessly. Taoism embraces polarities without erasing their differences. Buddhism maps consciousness in ways that are both empirically grounded and spiritually profound. These traditions helped shape Jung's symbolic epistemology, a way of knowing that honors both objective facts and inner truths. This integration isn't easy. It requires scientists to be open to symbols and spiritual seekers to welcome critical thinking. It demands that knowledge admits it doesn't have all the answers, and that faith welcomes doubt as part of the path. It calls for maturity, the ability to live in the tension between what we can see and what we can't. But it's in that tension where real insight is born. Symbolic thinking, when grounded, can open doors that rationalism and dogma can't. It offers knowledge that doesn't just explain, but transforms. A kind of understanding that leads to self-understanding. Jung never aimed to replace science with spirituality, or to reduce spirituality to science. He wanted a way of knowing that honored the whole human experience, one that could listen to symbols without dismissing data, and embrace personal experience without abandoning method. A psychology that could serve as a bridge between the world of matter and the world of soul. This effort to unify science and spirit is still one of the greatest challenges and promises of our time. Because only a science that honors the spirit and only a spirituality that respects reason can truly speak to the full complexity of what it means to be human. So the question is, if body and soul coexist, why do reason and spirit still walk apart? And what within you is ready to bring them back together? The idea of being human is often treated as something given, a static condition, a fixed identity we're born into. But for Carl Gustav Jung, being human isn't a state. It's a process, an ongoing evolution. We aren't born fully human, we become. And that becoming is, above all, a symbolic journey toward the self, a path that requires awareness, inner confrontation, transformation, and integration. This is the foundation of Jung's symbolic philosophy of existence. Life isn't just about biological survival or psychological development. It's an archetypal journey, an inner drama filled with symbols, images, conflict, and revelation, where each person is both the protagonist and witness of their own story. Humanity, in this sense, is a task, not a starting point, but an ideal to be cultivated. At the center of this journey is the process of individuation. But to individuate doesn't mean to isolate yourself or to become special. It means striving to become whole, reconciling light and shadow, reason and instinct, the masculine and the feminine, ego and unconscious. For Jung, becoming human means becoming more and more conscious of who we are and what lives within us, and then acting in the world with authenticity. This view challenges any limited definition of identity. We are not just what we inherit or what others expect us to be. We're also not just the social mask we wear or the desires that pull us. We are a process, and that process is symbolic, not linear. It doesn't follow external goals, but moves to the rhythm of an inner, unique path for each soul. The symbolism of the journey appears in all myths, and Jung highlighted it masterfully. The hero who sets out, faces trials, descends into the underworld, finds allies, transforms, and returns with treasure. That's a metaphor for deep human development. It's not just a literary plot, it's an archetypal map of how the soul seeks wholeness. So, to be human is to be in motion. It means embracing incompleteness as a vocation. It means recognizing that each stage of life brings symbolic challenges. Birth, separation, love, loss, creation, aging, and death. They're all rites of passage for the soul, and each one calls for awareness, presence, and symbolic interpretation. This view also invites an ethic of being unfinished. Full humanity isn't a standard to be imposed, it's a calling to be heard. There's no fixed model of a complete person. Each of us walks our path in a unique way, responding to the symbolic images that rise from the unconscious, confronting our shadows, and discovering meaning that only unfolds through experience. Jung's vision is both existential and spiritual, because life, for him, isn't just a series of events, it's a process of ongoing meaning-making. Every experience can be seen symbolically. Every crisis can be understood as a call to go deeper. Every relationship can reflect back parts of ourselves. In this way, humanity is also about relationship, with others, with the world, with the mystery. No one becomes whole alone. Encounters with others, in friendship, in love, in conflict, are always opportunities for greater awareness. Others reveal parts of ourselves we can't see on our own. They challenge us, wound us, teach us. Humanity is intersubjective. It's shaped through the symbolic mirror of otherness. This journey is long, often hard, and never finished. That's why Jung said the self is an asymptotic ideal, something that guides us but is never fully reached. Humanity, then, isn't a destination, it's a lifelong calling, a pull toward wholeness that's never complete. but renewed with every conscious act, every embraced symbol, every ethical choice. This symbolic philosophy of life offers a reconciliation between depth and simplicity. You don't need to live extraordinary experiences to fulfill your humanity. The ordinary, when lived symbolically, is sacred. Everyday life is the stage for transformation. Every soulful act, listening, forgiving, holding ambiguity, loving with presence, is a step toward becoming more human. Jung didn't offer a moralistic ideal of perfection. He offered a living ethic, where being human means embracing conflict, listening to symbols, and transforming pain into meaning. He invites us to give up the need to be flawlessly consistent, and instead to embrace complexity as the signature of a soul in motion toward wholeness. In this context, suffering isn't failure, it's part of the path. Crisis isn't an end, it's a transition. Doubt isn't weakness, it's an invitation to depth. To become human is to allow ourselves to live all of this with honesty, reverence, and surrender. So humanity isn't measured by external achievements, but by how much of the soul we can bring into our actions, our relationships, and our choices. To be human is to live symbolically, to give form to what's still unnamed inside us, but already alive and calling. The question is, are you living your humanity as a fixed identity, or as a symbolic journey towards something greater than yourself? Thank you for being here and allowing this content to be part of your journey. If something inside you was touched, subscribe to the channel. This symbolic path is ongoing, and you are an essential part of it. Like the video, share it with someone who's also looking to grow from the inside out, and let us know in the comments what resonated most with your experience. And remember, there are more videos waiting for you. Each one is a new step on this inner journey. Stay with us.